Hello, and welcome to this new series from Rotted Entertainment, Agatha Christie, Read With Me. Each video in this series will cover a different Agatha Christie novel, tackling them in chronological order of release date as first-time reads for myself. The way this will be structured is with video chapter markers indicating relative chapters in the book. After each chapter read, I will take a few minutes to discuss some of the details that just occurred, add to a string theory board to track evidence, clues, and timelines, and theorize as we go. I'm including a link to a free download of the book from the Gutenberg Project down below in the description if you would like to read along with me and see if your takeaways match my discoveries as we work together to solve the mysteries Agatha Christie laid out for us. So please, join me as we tackle her very first novel, published in 1921, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. All right, so now chapter 1 is in the bag, and it seems like there's both not a lot to talk about and quite a bit to talk about. That's kind of the nature of a lot of fiction literature, as we get introduced to settings, characters, situations, and the author begins laying the groundwork of the foundation for the novel. So at this point, let's go ahead and go to our Insanity string theory board and take a look at what we've learned so far. All right, so Mysterious Affair at Styles. We have a load of characters that were introduced to us, and we got to keep track of them all. So this is my way of doing just that. So we get introduced to our point of view, perspective, protagonist character of Hastings. I was originally not going to include that as a character on the board, but it kind of seems like it's important. There's going to be a lot of interaction happening there. And of the two Agatha Christie novels that I have read thus far, one of them was The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. So I'll just leave that right alone as I move on and introduce the rest of the characters. I do have Hercule Poirot here just because it was mentioned here in chapter 1. Hastings mentioned that he met the Belgian detective here, and we haven't interacted with him, but still, just kind of keeping him off to the side for right now. So everything kind of right now is centered around Emily Inglethorpe, or Emily Cavendish, as was her name from the previous marriage, to Mr. Oh, that's wrong. To Mr. Cavendish. All right, so his name is in red because he's deceased. I'm going to be doing a lot of color coding of this board here. For instance, the relationship lines that are happening between characters here. If it's just describing the actual relationship and not like an action or a clue or a motive, anything along those lines, it'll be blue. And then as those other things pop up, I will color code them appropriately. So this is going to be all over the place, but I'm going to try and keep it nicely organized and easy to reference. So right now, again, nothing much has actually happened. We're just getting introduced to these characters. The chapter did end with a bit of a row as we wound up with the character of Evelyn Evie Howard quitting her job. Back to Emily here. She is the matriarch of Styles Court, wealthy, likes to throw bazaars and social events, and is remarried now to Alfred Inglethorpe. This was the best picture I could really come up with on short notice. I chose it because of the big black beard. But yeah, second husband to Emily, 20 years her junior, long black beard, and people seem to take a distrust and dislike to him as he seems to just threaten the family fortune by his very existence. Then we have the two sons of Emily here, John and Lawrence Cavendish. John being the one that met up with Hastings and is married to Mary Cavendish, who is good friends with Dr. Bauerstein, who we kind of get introduced to at the very, very end of the chapter, who is in town for a rest after a breakdown, an expert on poison. I don't think that will necessarily come to fruition, but we'll have to see. There's going to be a lot of red herrings thrown out, I'm sure. And we'll just have to kind of keep track of them all and see how this goes. And then a brief mention of Mrs. Rakes, who Evie said that Alfred was spending a lot of time with in her argument with Emily that caused her to quit. Then we also have Cynthia, who is the protege of Emily, conned out of her own money and then taken under the wing of Emily. And she also works at the Red Cross in a dispensary. So at this point, I don't know who is going to be murdered. If there is going to be a murder, this could just simply be a fun little novel. So let's be honest. Somebody's getting murdered. I don't know who, I don't know how, but I have a feeling if I were to guess at this point, Emily or Alfred would be murdered. Either one, it seems like all the characters would have a really decent motive in their attempts to off them in terms of the money, in terms of history, anything along those lines. By having every character having a motive, it definitely adds to the mystery of things. And if I were to guess, considering that we have already had discussions of poison, Cynthia works at a dispensary, Dr. Bauerstein is an expert in poisons, I'm going to guess that one or the other is going to be poisoned. So that's about all my theory board has to offer right now. I do have a bit of a timeline going, a grand timeline, but that's really pretty sparse at the moment. We've only covered one day and there's a lot more to go. So let's see what chapter 2 has to offer in the mysterious case at Styles. See you soon. Chapter 2, the 16th and 17th of July, is now under our belts, and oh boy, are we setting up a whole lot here. The stage is still being set. We're still propping things up and building that foundation. However, now the pieces are being put into place so that they can finally make their moves. And perhaps they already have, and we just don't know it yet. Now, there was a little bit of wording in this right at the beginning of the chapter that was very odd to me, and it kind of took me a little bit to kind of wrap my head around, and it actually made me really appreciate the string theory insanity board that I've been building, because I just saw the discrepancy because of that, and I'll just go ahead and show you here. So I've tweaked things a little bit. And as far as the timeline, a lot of this is going to need to be tweaked as I go and as things start to progress in terms of organization. But that's the whole nature of this. This is the first video, and I'm sure there's going to be a whole lot of malleability needed. So one of the things was I kind of deviated from the horizontal grand timeline and instead made it a vertical one, and then broke it into 3 pieces hourly, which we haven't gotten to yet. But if this is anything like the other Agatha Christie novels I've read, we are going to need at some point an hour by hour breakdown. And the minute times start getting introduced, there will be notes under there. The grand timeline over the entire sequence of the book, and then various details in the 3rd column of those particular grand timeline days. So I had a lot of the events that was happening in Saturday and Sunday of July 14th and 15th, like before the actual chapter of the 16th and 17th really started. And here's the reason that I did that, and I found my folly later on. So it was written here, the 16th of July fell on a Monday. It was a day of turmoil. The famous bazaar had taken place on Saturday, and an entertainment in connection with the same charity at which Mrs. Inglethorpe was to recite a war poem was to be held that night. The wording of that did trip me up, because I really took that as the famous bazaar had taken place on Saturday, so on and so forth, and was to be held that night. So I started the sequence of events from Saturday. It should have been read more carefully by me and interpreted differently by me as the 16th of July fell on a Monday. It was a day of turmoil. So this is the day we're talking about. And then just going back and saying the bazaar had taken place on Sunday, and then an entertainment is taking place on the day of subject, which I kind of started to realize once I started to get into the chapter, and the chapter was kind of finishing off. And by my estimation, we hadn't yet gotten to the titular chapter of 16th and 17th. So that's when I realized my mistake. It may be a little thing, I don't know. You never really can discount the little things in these novels. So I corrected the timeline, and now it is as it is. So let's take a look at some of the various events that happened here. We do have a note here that a letter arrived from Evelyn to Hastings, wanting to know if Mrs. Inglethorpe wants to reconcile. We don't know exactly when that letter arrived. We only know that it was between July 5th, the day of the chapter 1 and the day she quit, and the day of the bazaar. So somewhere between there. So I kind of just put it loosely on the timeline in that middle area. 14th Saturday was the day of the bazaar. 16th Monday. So we skipped 2 days, and now we're into the actual chapter meat of things. So John is restless, displays unusual behavior. the day was pretty much just kind of going over the entertainment stuff. Not a whole lot happened this day. The 17th is when real stuff really kicks off. Cynthia didn't return with the group and asked to stay for a supper party with her friends for the night. Possibly nothing, possibly something. We got the note down just in case. Tuesday the 17th. This is when things really start happening. So Emily, Mrs. Inglethorpe, slept in and made an appearance at 12:30, appearing to be her brisk self. The day before had taken it out of her. She was tired. After she woke up, she took Hastings and Lawrence to the luncheon. Mary went with Dr. Bauerstein instead, and once the luncheon was all wrapped up, the entire group decided to visit Cynthia at the hospital after Mrs. Inglethorpe offered to drop them off. She didn't want to really stick around, visit, so she drop them off and then head back home. So Cynthia showed the group around the hospital, pointed out the poison cabinet to Lawrence, and while they were going on the tour, Lawrence straggled behind. Something? Nothing? We'll see. Lawrence and Cynthia, usually reserved, were quite chipper this time around. All right, so the luncheon and visiting Cynthia is wrapped up. Then we go back to the house. We do get introduced, before I get onto that, in the visiting Cynthia portion of that, to a new character, and so far, as of yet, not really identified with any physical descriptor, not even any gender, but the character of Nibs. So I put them as coworker and don't really have a picture to go with them, don't have any descriptor at all, just Nibs. So now we're back at the house. Mary didn't walk with Dr. Bauerstein, turns out. Hastings got back, asked how the walk was, and she was really not having any of it. It wasn't seemed to be too happy about it, but she didn't go for a walk with them, didn't expand on that at all. And then Mrs. Inglethorpe was upset about something, didn't really get into it. Afterward, after Mrs. Inglethorpe retired to her boudoir, Hastings went outside to join Cynthia for a game of tennis, and while he was outside, he could overhear through the window a tense exchange between Mary and Emily Inglethorpe. All he really got out of it was Mary wanted Emily to show her something. She just wouldn't. Doesn't concern you, not going to show you. And I might have known you would shield him, replied Mary. So something's going on there. And then once Hastings meets back up with Cynthia, she gossips that apparently the new character of Dorcas, which, wow, that's a name, who is the parlor maid. No association really that I have yet, but that's a new character created in the list. That Dorcas overheard, by having an ear close to the door of the boudoir, an argument between Mrs. and Mr. Inglethorpe. What the nature of the argument is, we don't know. All we know is that it was a heated row, and Cynthia seems pretty excited by that. She's just really eager for Mr. Inglethorpe to hit the bricks, for Emily to kick him out and to be done with him out of their lives. So after that, we have dinner and coffee. Now it seems like the finer details are really starting to get explained, which means shit's going to go down. We know that shit's going to go down at some point, and it's coming to be, in my estimation, to be pretty much what I thought, that at some point, hasn't happened yet, but Mrs. Inglethorpe is going to get poisoned. So dinner was a quiet affair. Mr. Inglethorpe was reserved, not really chatty. And after that, Mrs. Inglethorpe retired to her boudoir again, asks Mary to bring her coffee. Mary brings the coffee to Hastings and Cynthia, asks Cynthia to take Emily her coffee, and Mr. Inglethorpe offers to do it instead. Lawrence follows him. That was a quick little line, but I did notice it, I did pick up on it, and it was a note that I put in. Mr. Inglethorpe brought the coffee, Lawrence followed him. After which Dr. Bauerstein arrives caked in mud, making a claim of discovering a new species of fern and failing along the attempt and falling into mud, and then the sun drying him out. After which time, Mrs. Inglethorpe appears in the hall in view of Hastings, Cynthia, and John, asks for her dispatch case, says she's going to retire to bed, and was standing there holding her yet untasted coffee. And then Dr. Bauerstein stands to leave. Mr. Inglethorpe offers to join him in the village. I must see our agent over those estate accounts. So these are the fine details that I have currently laid out right now, and we will have to see how things shake out. But it really does seem like the way that things are being positioned is that coffee that Mrs. Inglethorpe is holding is indeed poisoned, and we are establishing time of events leading up to her death. But I could be wrong. We'll see. But so far, if that is the case, we are establishing not only a strong series of motives, but also a strong series of opportunities across different characters. We have Dr. Bauerstein, who is an expert on poisons. We have Cynthia, who has pharmacology and access to poisons, who pointed out to Lawrence where the poison cabinet is. We have all sorts of stuff in play now that could potentially lead to the death of Emily Inglethorpe. But we'll see. Maybe she lives. Maybe it's somebody else that gets it accidentally. Who knows? Anything can happen in chapter 3. So I'm going to go ahead and read that and check back in. I'll see you in just a moment. Wow. A lot happened there. It was a relatively short chapter, but very, very dense with content. And we finally have our murder. The setup is over. The execution has begun, literally. And in this, we are introduced to the first little picture chart that Agatha Christie offered of a diagram of a household. And in this, we see that Mrs. Inglethorpe's room is surrounded on either side with Alfred's room and Cynthia's room, both of which have a door leading to them, but it doesn't do her any good because all of the doors, including the one to the hallway, is locked from the inside as she's convulsing and going through her poisoned fits. So let's go ahead and take a look at the newly updated string theory board of insanity. So technically, this is Wednesday. It's around 5 in the morning when Hastings gets woken up by Lawrence. So yeah, Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, however you want to slice it. And I think the book will kind of be leaning more towards the night of the murder, so kind of indicating Tuesday. But let's just not get bogged down in those details for the moment. Eventually they may come to fruition. But anyway, so yes, Lawrence wakes Hastings up. Mother has fallen ill, and then all 3 doors are found to be locked. The group then tries to find, which door can be broken down, and the one in Cynthia's room adjoining Emily's is the best candidate. And when they get into Cynthia's room, Mary is trying to wake her, trying to rouse her. But yeah, something's off there. Cynthia is not waking up easily. She's groggy. You'd think that with the panic that was happening here, that under normal circumstances, she would just snap to and be right with everybody else in that moment of panic. But that didn't happen. So they break into the room and find that Emily Inglethorpe is having these convulsions and is on her way to death. A few little details that are worth noting here. One is the overturned table, likely by convulsions. I have seen instances in novels such as this where it is not necessarily overturned by convulsions, but by the circumstances in which the killer did something. And then also Lawrence turning pale as a ghost, sheet white, looking behind Hastings as he's talking to him, something that was happening in the further side of the wall. Hastings turned around, didn't see anything of note. No idea what that was, but definitely made note of it because there was something there. Then Dr. Bauerstein comes in, who claims that he was just walking by the gate of the manor as a car ran out to fetch Dr. Wilkins, who's a new character, and ran up the driveway and went to see what was going on and approaches things in the final convulsion before Mrs. Inglethorpe finally succumbs and perishes. Her dying words, Alfred. With Alfred nowhere to be seen. She was looking at Dr. Bauerstein as she said that and then passed. And then we get to the moments after. Dr. Wilkins arrives and he and Dr. Bauerstein speak in private. Clearly there's an idea on both of their minds that they don't want to discuss with everybody else. So they go off, lock the door behind them. And then while they're out, Hastings explains to Mary he thinks that Emily was poisoned, which just causes harry-carry. She doesn't like that. She scones upstairs. He thinks she's gonna faint, and she just, I need a minute alone. Leave me alone. I need to process this. And that's when everybody starts discussing, well, where the hell is Alfred? His bed wasn't slept in. He's not around. His wife just died. What the heck is going on is kind of the general phrase that starts floating around. So then the two doctors come down, and after their conversation together, they explain to John that they cannot fill out a death certificate unless they actually do a post-mortem and have a thorough investigation. Speaking of investigation, Hastings then broaches the subject to Lawrence with John right there of the idea of entrusting Mr. Poirot, that he should be brought in to investigate just in case Hastings' theory of poisoning is true. If there's any malfeasance, anything like that, then time is of the essence and they should get Poirot ASAP. And the person that he thought would be on board with that, of Lawrence, balked, did not like that whatsoever, thought it was a stupid idea, turned it down flat. It was John that actually said that might actually be a pragmatic move. If there's nothing to be found, then it'll be a quick investigation and we can move on. Dr. Bauerstein then removes 2 keys from his pocket and hands them to John, saying that they are the keys to the 2 rooms and that he had already locked them and they should stay locked because an inquiry is most likely bound to happen and the scene should remain untouched. So after all of this, Hastings goes to retrieve Poirot, only first stopping to grab a medical book that details strychnine poisoning. So I did do some updating beyond just the bullet points that were happening here for the July 18th Wednesday morning. I did update some characters. We now have Dr. Wilkins involved. And I also made some points to include some more details on the characters that were already there. And a lot of this is repetitive. A lot of this already happened within the timeline bullet points, but I did want to include them just on character profile levels, just so that I can kind of have a bigger, grander overview of what was going on and who did what. So that's kind of the key here, is anything that was put in black was just generally a characteristic, a trait, an establishing point of that person. If they actually did something or witnessed something or anything along those lines, it's in red. It's an actionable thing along with the chapter reference that that event happened in. If you see a name in blue, such as right here, has a row with Alfred, Cynthia in parentheses in blue, that means that we only have that information based on that character's hearsay. We did not have Hastings witness it. If Hastings does witness it, being our protagonist, we just accept it as tentative truth, not enough to actually just put Hastings in parentheses all over the place. It's the default. But if anybody actually tells Hastings, I heard something or I saw this, it goes in blue parentheses, because that doesn't necessarily mean it's truth. It only means we know what that person told us. And as we know from Poirot himself, everybody has a secret. Everybody lies, and we will get to the bottom of it one way or another. So of this cavalcade of characters, who do we think is the actual killer? Who determined what happened? Who is our prime suspect? Well, we have a number of things on the docket here. We have Lawrence, first and foremost. There's a lot that's going on there. And honestly, John, I have to mention that John isn't a suspect in my mind, but there's a lot that's kind of happening around him without actually happening to him. If you look here, there's only one actionable line that I really had to put there, and that was agreeing to contact Poirot. In chapters 2 and 3, he was largely absent, just kind of being in the background, in the distance, nothing really happening there. Lawrence was constantly involved with certain things. So he was part of the tour. Lawrence was part of the tour that Cynthia took Hastings on. And yeah, if you recall, she pointed out the poison medicine cabinet to him. He also lagged behind. He followed Alfred as he went to give the coffee to Mrs. Inglethorpe. And the witnessing of something in the room that made him very pale. So maybe there was something in the room that he missed in his attempt to clean up whatever forensic, what have you, and he saw it. I don't know. We're going to have to find out. But he is definitely right up there in my person of interest, let's just say. Maybe you'll come up with another, sticky note, another portion of this board here, person of interest, and kind of put some bullet points there, but we'll see. Dr. Bauerstein, I'm not really suspecting him quite yet. Yes, he's an expert on poisons, But that honestly it feels a little too easy. It feels like the finger would be pointed at him based on that. And that would just be too simple to first choice. Not to mention, he's also saying that there's going to be an inquest, and I don't necessarily think that he's innocent, but I don't know that he's guilty of this murder. Now, Mary could be involved here. She did have a row with Mrs. Inglethorpe, or at the very least, a very tense conversation. She is a strong friend of Dr. Bauerstein, so maybe through that friendship, she has access to some poisons. She was asked to bring the coffee to Emily, but instead poured coffee to Cynthia and Hastings and asked Cynthia to take the coffee, wherein Alfred jumped in and said, no, I'll do it. But what if the particular cup was already poisoned? She handed out the other cups and then asked Cynthia to take the coffee in her place so that it would alleviate suspicion away from her. Possibly. And then also being particularly distraught with Hastings' theory of poison. If that's the first conclusion that somebody's coming to, that's obviously not the thing that she wants anybody focused on. If she is the killer, then she would want people to think that it's simply a heart attack and move on. The idea that poison is floating around in the conversation would cause her to be distraught, even though it does seem like the most obvious and likely thing. As far as the idea of maybe Cynthia having anything to do with it, I'm really not on board with that. I think that perhaps maybe if it is Lawrence, then she would be an accomplice, maybe even an unwitting accomplice. But that's about, I think, as far as that'll go. I am wondering where the hell Alfred is. Things are looking awfully suspicious there. Between having the fight with his wife, leaving to see our agent over estate accounts, and then being nowhere to be seen during the actual convulsions and death, it just seems awfully suspicious. I still don't think entirely. That's my weakest person of interest. I think in order for me, it goes Lawrence, Mary, then Alfred. I think everybody else, I'm not dismissing anybody at all. Even Poirot himself is a suspect as far as I'm concerned, but we'll find out more in chapter 4. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Let's get to reading, and I'll join you back up in just a moment. Chapter 4, Poirot investigates. Holy God, was this a lot of information. As would be expected, Poirot is now on the case. He has been enlisted by Hastings to come over to the house and check things out, and he doesn't waste a moment. I could talk about this chapter for hours, but we don't have that kind of time, so let's just go ahead and dive right in and take a look at the updates to the board, and they are aplenty. So I'm going to not even show my face. I don't want to miss a thing. So let's check it out. Yeah, it's a lot of new stuff. So, first of all, over here we have the event breakdown category. So, like I said, this is my first attempt at making one of these boards. This is my first video foray into this whole series. So I'm learning as I'm going, I'm adapting as I'm going, and eventually things will get more refined as they go on. We'll see how this whole video series turns out by the time I get to the 34th book. It may be really locked in by then, but right now it's very malleable. So the event breakdown category has been created. So this is basically when we take a singular event in the grand timeline detail and really, really trim it down, make some big notes about any major event. And in this case, the argument that was overheard by Dorcas was a massive event. And there were several things that kind of stood out to me in that regard. First of all, I don't know if anybody else picked up on this, but she only assumes that it's Mr. Inglethorpe having the argument with Mrs. Inglethorpe. She heard Mrs. Inglethorpe's voice clearly, but did not hear any actual words spoken by Alfred. Instead, it was just a low voice that she could kind of hear. I'm assuming a masculine male voice without actually understanding the words. She's pretty certain it was Mr. Inglethorpe, but this made actually some painstaking efforts to only have one side of the conversation, and I don't think that was necessarily on accident. So we have, "You have lied to me and deceived me. I kept you and clothed you and fed you, bringing disgrace upon your name. You need not think that any fear of publicity or scandal between husband and wife will deter me." That's an interesting statement to make there, because it's not necessarily, or fear of scandal of our marriage, but scandal of between husband and wife. So we're talking about assuming that it isn't Mr. Inglethorpe, a married couple. And there's only really 3 married couples that were really introduced into this whole series so far. We have Mr. and Mrs. Inglethorpe. We have Mr. Inglethorpe and let's go ahead and take a gander here. Alfred Inglethorpe and Mrs. Rakes, wife of nearby farmer. We haven't met the farmer yet, so that's all a bit unknown there, but we do know that she's married. So, if we're talking about scandal between husband and wife, she would be a contender there. And John and Mary Cavendish. Now, I'm thinking John. We are talking about somebody that has a masculine male voice, not really understanding the words, but the tone was apparently coming through the door. And we also know that Mary had her row with Emily, or at the very least a stern conversation, not necessarily an argument, but that Hastings overheard, and that happened later. So why would the same kind of conversation happen twice with the same person? I'm kind of thinking it wouldn't. I'm thinking that she was having it out with John, especially being the stepmother, stepson kind of relationship there. So, in terms of I kept you and clothed you and fed you, you bring disgrace upon our name, things like that. I'm thinking it's John. So, and then 5 o'clock, Mrs. Inglethorpe rang the bell to have the tea in her boudoir. Some piece of paper held in her hand seems shooketh by it. These few words and everything's changed. Never trust a man, Dorcas. Scandal between husband and wife is a dreadful thing. And then Mrs. Cavendish came in, further leading to my thoughts that she was speaking to John earlier. And I'm thinking that this point, when Mrs. Cavendish came in, is the point where Hastings overheard from the window. But who's to say? That could be a little while later. But that was between 4 and 5. So now we take a look at this on the new timeline, hourly timeline. And I kind of separated this out into 4 days, the meat of which I have in more of a spread out area so that more events can happen here. And we see the events that were tied in with that particular event breakdown right here. 4 o'clock, around 4 o'clock, according to Dorcas, might be a little later. She overhears the argument. And at 5 o'clock, Dorcas brings Mrs. Inglethorpe tea once she rings the bell. So that's when the 2 events there happened. We also know from the interviews that Poirot goes through later on that lunchtime, Mrs. Inglethorpe lost a key to the purple case and asked Dorcas to look for it. The key that was later on found in the case in the room by Poirot. We'll get to that in a little bit here. 8 o'clock, coffee served. 8 to 8:30, estimated time that Mrs. Inglethorpe drank the coffee. 7:15, Annie brings cocoa up to the table. What table? I'll show you in a moment. And then 8 o'clock, Annie brings cocoa from the table to Mrs. Inglethorpe. So what's all this about cocoa? Well, has a lot to do with what's right going on here, because we finally get into the room itself and Poirot investigates the room. And in doing so, he finds a lot, more than Hastings does. And at the same time, Hastings kind of takes some note of things that Poirot doesn't necessarily seem all that interested in, which kind of tracks with how these investigations sometimes will go. So let's go ahead and take a look at the 6 things that Poirot saw that were very interesting to him. The saucepan of cocoa was not one of them that was interesting, but it was interesting to Hastings. We do have, however, over here on the fireplace, something that scared Lawrence, as well as the fragment found in there that they deduce was part of the will and testament. Stain on the floor, smells of coffee, and that happened right here by the window, in which the round top table was loose, the top of it, and when Poirot put his case on there, it fell. So that seems like a pretty good indicator that the coffee or something like that was put on the table and it fell, or somebody smashed into the table, broke it, and loosened the top, creating that stain that smelled of coffee right there. And Poirot seems particularly interested about that. So I think that that's definitely something worth noting. Dark green fabric found in the door bolt of door B here, which was adjacent to Alfred's room. Interesting there. candle grease stain. Annie confirms that it was not there when she was tending to Mrs. Inglethorpe for the evening. The purple dispatch case with the key in the lock, confirmed as the key lost by Mrs. Inglethorpe, according to Dorcas, right here on the writing desk. Debris mostly kind of just broken in general ways right here by the table. However, the coffee cup itself was smashed to powder. And lastly, the empty sleeping powders box with no chemist's name on it right over here in the drawer of the washstand. So some interesting little bits of clues there, as well as in the wastebasket of the boudoir, this possessed, I am possessed, he is possessed, I am possessed, possessed note. What does this mean? Who wrote it? What is the possessed thing? It's a lot of unknowns there. We did kind of go over some notes here as far as, according to Dorcas, Mrs. Inglethorpe could not have taken the sleeping powder because she ran out 2 days prior, and didn't have any more made. So the box supposedly was empty. Annie brings the cocoa every night, and we know that because when asked about it, we have here the map and diagram to the floor plan of the first floor area itself, or this particular wing of it. And Poirot makes specific mention that it is this table on this side of the wall right here, not on the servant side, in which Annie sets the cocoa until Mrs. Inglethorpe is ready to retire for the evening. And then in preparation for that, she will take the cocoa from here and then deliver it to her room. Annie and Dorcas both confirmed that the household owns no dark green dresses, that Mrs. Cavendish owns a light green dress, but that doesn't really fit the bill. We also note that Mrs. Inglethorpe wrote 4 letters the night of her death, 1 to Miss Howard, 1 to Mr. Wells the lawyer, 1 to Ross's the caterer, and a 4th unknown recipient. And then Annie notices salt on the cocoa tray, dusted it off, and delivered it nonetheless, which gets Hastings all antsy in the pantsy, thinking that that was indeed the strychnine, but Poirot doesn't seem to think that that's much interest. There's not a whole lot going on there, and that is causing some loggerheads between the two. So we have the general timeline happening here, in which there's this big gap of information that happens between the time that coffee is served, cocoa is brought up to the table, and Mrs. Inglethorpe dies at 5 a.m. And what happened between those times? Well, that's where the meat of the mystery really lies. That's a lot of clues, and that's a lot of information, and that's a lot of interviewing. Most notably, we do have some more information now about the staff of Styles Court, which we do kind of get into a little bit more here. We see that we have a little bit more of a complete pattern here with Dorcas and Annie as both parlor maids, or I'm assuming Annie's a parlor maid. It kind of seems like there may be some alternate title that has not yet been announced. I don't know exactly what the roles of the household may be. I did watch a lot of Downton Abbey, but it has been a little while. So for right now, parlor maid will fit the bill. And then we have 3 gardeners, Manning, young William, and a new one who all we know about her is that she is female, but we don't know age, anything along those lines. So we have a new gardener, and the gardener piece of information could be interesting because we do know that sometime that afternoon, the gardeners were tending to the flower beds outside of the boudoir. Where the boudoir is, we don't really know quite yet. I'm kind of looking up what a boudoir really is, and from what I can understand, it seems to be a room for arranging oneself, getting oneself ready, and that would not necessarily be the bedroom, it would not necessarily be the bathroom, it would be the boudoir, and that is not a room that is specifically listed in the floor plan map here. We have spare room, my room, bathroom, spare room, and then everybody else's assigned room. So in relation to the rest of the house and these rooms, I am not yet certain where the boudoir actually stands. It could be downstairs, could be upstairs. I think it's downstairs from some of the verbiage that's been used, but it's a little bit nebulous at this point. I'm wondering if we're going to get a diagram of the overall house or any other floors. Could be useful, who knows, but the fact that the gardeners were attending to the garden that afternoon, and Poirot seems to be making a pretty strong mental note of it while everybody else is brushing off that fact, kind of makes me think that it's going to be coming back here. So, do I have any other updates to my suspicions? No, it's too early. I think what we need to do at this point is take a look at this evidence, really kind of process it and start whittling away. I have a feeling there's going to be more interviews. I have a feeling there's going to be more revelations. I guarantee there's going to be more revelations. But I have a feeling that some of these clues are going to get dismissed, and then we're going to have additional clues stacked on top. So let's go ahead and move on and see what chapter 5 is going to bring us. It isn't Strychnine, is it? Chapter 5 is now under our belts, and we can kind of evaluate some of the new information that was presented, and there was a fair bit of it. We have a few new characters, we have a few new revelations, we have some action happening, and we have our first real timeline discrepancy. But to get into that, let's go ahead and take a look at the board and review what we have learned in this new chapter. So I've added here a couple of different new things. Annie Dorcas spoken from the household owns no dark green dresses, and John seems relieved when he is told by Mr. Wells that he and Mr. Inglethorpe will have to be interviewed as witnesses, but nobody else. This was an interesting point for me. You'd think that if John had a hand in things, he would not want to be interviewed, but at the same time, he expresses relief. If he didn't have a hand in things, then, again, he wouldn't want to be interviewed, but if he didn't, you'd think that there would be not necessarily relief, just generally, okay, let's proceed. But relief, that's an odd thing. So the best that I can come up with in terms of a theory is that he is relieved that he has to answer things, but that perhaps somebody else doesn't. His general line of inquiry was along the lines of, will everybody have to be interviewed? And when it was just coming down to, no, just he and Mr. Inglethorpe, relief. I also wanted to go into the coffee pour details. Just Mrs. Cavendish pours from the tray, delivers 3 cups, 1 to Hastings, Cynthia, and 1 for herself. Alfred pours and then delivers to Mrs. Inglethorpe. Lawrence's half-empty cup was found by the mantel, and John's empty cup was found on the tray, with Mr. Inglethorpe not taking coffee himself. And the known wills. We have the first one that Wells knew about August of last year, the last known up until a certain point will and testament for Mrs. Inglethorpe. John benefits revoked when remarried. So when she remarried and married Alfred, then the will became null and void. And apparently, according to John, he had already discussed this with her the day of the murder, which is interesting. The second will would be the burned one that we only have the scrap of paper here, showing that it even existed. Any other example of it ever existing seems to be burnt up in smoke. And the third one that was discussed towards the end of the chapter, Poirot reveals that Mr. Wells talked to him, and Mr. Wells and John both were surprised to find it locked in the desk of the boudoir, dated before her marriage, so likely when she was engaged to Alfred, with Alfred named as specific benefactor. So, another aspect here that I have added is, first of all, I have added questions, because I have questions aplenty, and it really kind of felt like I was needing to get them out of my head. I can't juggle everything in my head. That's why I have the board string theory of insanity here. So, questions. Who killed Mrs. Inglethorpe? That seems like a pretty good one. Seems like a decent enough question to ask. Cause of death. This is going to be, I think, something that is going to be happening fairly soon, because the autopsy is going to be happening soon, and we also have the inquest that's going to be happening soon. So I think we're going to start getting to the specific cause of death, and whether or not that actually leads any clarity, we'll just have to see. But it is a question that's up in the air, and it's a darn good one, considering all the different poisons and other aspects of things that could be floating around. Who stole the key to the document case? That's a fairly good question. Whoever it is doesn't realize that there was a spare key in the room already, and it bears finding out. Why did Lawrence follow Alfred in delivering the coffee? That was a very small point that was made, but it was definitely one that caught my eye. Alfred pours the coffee for Mrs. Inglethorpe, and when he goes to deliver it, Lawrence follows him. Why? Who broke the round tabletop, spilling coffee, and when? Could it have always been, just this family heirloom round tabletop that was janky and nobody really, Mrs. Inglethorpe knew enough not to... Who broke it? Was it years ago? Was it the day of the murder? Was it the night of the murder? Was it just before the murder? And generally, who and when? What was the paper that Mrs. Inglethorpe was shooketh about? I'm sure that will get revealed. Everything's going to get revealed, let's be honest. Who was Mrs. Inglethorpe arguing with that Dorcas overheard? Everything points to Mr. Inglethorpe, except the vagueness of the male voice that was never actually specified or heard with any sort of clarity leads me to think that it was somebody else. I already talked about that, but it is a question of who. We need that solidly, and that has not yet been answered. Why was Cynthia found so groggy the night of the murder? I have a feeling that may come into play with the empty box of sleeping powders. Apparently the sleeping powders were gone. Maybe, maybe not. Cynthia is the one that mixes them up. We'll have to find out. Maybe she mixed up a new batch and maybe something got confused. Maybe somebody knocked her out intentionally. Maybe somebody mixed things up. And where was Mr. Inglethorpe at the time of the murder in actuality? We're already pretty sure that he's lying his ass off, but where was he and why? We still need to know that for sure. So getting into the Poirot investigates preliminary findings here. I just wanted to bullet point some of these here. This is still the same day. This is Mrs. Inglethorpe dies at 5 a.m., then moments after with so on. Then Hastings runs out to fetch Poirot. So this is a bullet point that kind of covers the last two chapters here. Mr. Poirot investigates Mrs. Inglethorpe's bedroom, finds the 6 points of interest, then interviews Dorcas, interviews Annie. Then we get into the new chapter with looks at the coffee cups in the drawing room, has breakfast in the dining room where he learns Cynthia doesn't take sugar in her coffee, which turns his eyes emerald green. I love the way that Hastings phrases that, with Poirot's eyes gleaming when he gets excited about something. So best as I can figure, when Poirot was looking at the coffee cups and working with them and taking a little sample of each one into a different test tube, he was also tasting them. And I have a feeling something about it registered so that it didn't quite jive with Cynthia not taking sugar in her coffee. Perhaps the residue in all of the coffee cups were sweet, indicating that something was off there. Perhaps he tasted something quite bitter, like strychnine, and then maybe that was just kind of attributed to the bitter taste of coffee. I don't know yet. I don't know enough about pharmacology, about strychnine. From what I understand, it does have a bitter taste, not a sweet taste, but something in there made his eyes turn emerald green. So that's going to definitely be important there. Then he meets with John and Mr. Wells, discusses with will variations and the details. And at that point, we're only basically covering the first will and the fact that the second will existed and no longer does. Invites the Gardners in to verify his theory on the second will, which he does, and pretty much confirms that it's now destroyed, or possibly now destroyed. We certainly have a fragment of it, and it at one point did exist just the day prior. Then he goes and he greets Evelyn Howard, who shows up in a, I want to say rental car, but it's not quite right. She shows up and, she heard about the death and she is there at the property to lend a hand, and she wants to put the screws to Alfred. She is absolutely 100% certain that it is him. Poirot seems less certain, but he does assure her that whoever the killer is, he will or she will be caught. Then at that point, they go to Mrs. Inglethorpe's bedroom because they want to unlock and look at the documents within the case. But lo and behold, the dispatch case has been forced. The lock is broken. Somebody got in without the use of a key. It's also worth noting that the doors had been locked and Poirot had the keys. John unlocked the doors. He handed the keys to John. John unlocked them. I don't think there was a really necessary sequence of events in which John could have surreptitiously taken the keys, put them back. I think that would be a little too far-fetched. Right now, the only explanation as far as who could have gotten in the room to force that lock, that the other rooms bared similar keys that could have opened one of the doors. I'm still not entirely sure about that. I think there may be something a little else going on in terms of who was able to get into that room and when, but it could just be that that's the case. And at this, Poirot is upset with himself, upset with the world. He goes off and he goes on a rant and a tear about the house, yelling and so forth. And as soon as Hastings is within sight, he calms down immediately. There's something about that. I can't help but think that there's something about that that is causing Poirot to manipulate the household, to show his hand, or at the very least, the hand that he wants shown, that he's playing a psychological mind game on whomever might the guilty party be. So it was something there that it wasn't necessarily, and I'm still learning this character. I've only read one book of with Poirot in it so far. So perhaps he does fly off the handle. Perhaps he does get agitated and angry. I just haven't seen that happen yet. So this was a bit of an unusual characteristic for him. And I can't help but think that it was part of an actual master plan to psych somebody out, but we'll see. It's also worth noting that I didn't have the bullet point here and I should write it down, that we have the interaction between Hastings and Mary, which the whole relationship, the whole way that Hastings is talking about Mary the entire time here has always been a little suspect, has always been a little odd. Like he admires her perhaps a little bit too much. He sees these super fine details in her charisma and charm and ladylike beauty and so on, whereas everybody else just kind of gets okay, they look interesting. There's something about Mary that is enrapturing to him, and I can't help but think that maybe that's causing some glossing over things. And her relationship with Dr. Bauerstein seems to be causing a lot of jealousy sprung up in Hastings. It's like, why would that make you jealous? She's hanging out with a friend. She's a married woman. You are not really involved in all this. Why is this upsetting to you in the slightest? So yeah, that confrontation happened when Poirot burst out of the room and so on, and Hastings started to follow him before he lost sight. Mary comes down and has a slight smile on her face. How interesting. I'll get to that in just a second. Let's finish off the bullet point list here. So then they set off to leave. He sees Cynthia and asks her about the sleeping powder. She does indeed confirm that she has made bromide powders for Mrs. Inglethorpe. And then he discusses the nature of the third will found, which we already kind of went over here. Then he returns home with Hastings, discusses some of the conclusions he had, generally how he arrived to some of them, how he knew that the Gardners bared witness to the second will being drafted and signed. And, just generally, like, you've already seen the conclusions I've come to. Here's how I came to them. And then Mr. Mace, which is just a fantastic name for somebody that works at the chemist, comes over and is asking and making some inquiries about, I heard that there was a murder. I heard that it was possibly poison. It isn't strychnine, is it? We get the chapter title there. Answer unheard. We don't know what Poirot believes. So it could be strychnine, could be not. And we're still going to try and find that out. And then concludes with 2 facts from the day. 1, the state of the weather that time, or the day of the murder, was sunshiny, 80 degrees and beautiful. And 2, Mr. Inglethorpe wears peculiar clothes, has a black beard, and wears glasses. Now, all of this is still a little bit nebulous in my mind. Let's, before I get into kind of a summarization and any updates on theories, look at the time discrepancy or, so on that has happened here. So Dorcas confirmed that it was around 4 o'clock that she heard the argument happening between the male figure and Mrs. Inglethorpe. It couldn't have been a whole lot later, she said, but it was around 4, approximately 4. So that's when I basically put it on the timeline here. The Gardners confirmed that it was around 4 o'clock that Mrs. Inglethorpe first called them to fetch the blank will and then had them sign it. Now, at first, this was a little confusing for me, and it could be that it's not necessarily a time discrepancy. It could just be a sequence of events that happens rapid fire one after another, because the Gardners were called so that one of them could ride his bicycle into town and fetch the will papers. And then when he came back, then it was filled out and they bared witness and signed. So there was a time period that happened between those, and Poirot asked specifically, when was it that Mrs. Inglethorpe first called upon you? And that's when they said 4 o'clock. So we have this unknown time when they actually signed the will here, and the time that happened between them could have been where the argument happened. It could have been, go fetch me the will. They go off. Then we have the argument that happens between the mystery person and Mrs. Inglethorpe. And then when everything starts to roll out, fine. sometime between 4 and 5, the gardener signed the witness to the will, and we go off from there. So it's not necessarily a time discrepancy, but it still might yet be. We don't know if Poirot is going to use that as a sticking point to try and maybe refute Dorca's account of things. Who knows? It could be something there that we're not yet seeing, and we'll just have to find out how that plays out. So that's what I've got so far. If I had to come up with a theory right now, based on the evidence that we currently have, I would say that it's Mr. and Mrs. Cavendish, John and Mary, that are working in cahoots. John would be relieved if Mary was involved in all of this and didn't have to interview for any questions. Mary had a smile on her face, a slight smile at the corners of her face, seeing Poirot upset, which if she was the one that broke into the case, stole the contents, whatever evidence it might have been, and then sees the investigator just losing his shit, being upset and running down the halls yelling at things, yeah, that could make her a little bit happy. She just one-upped Poirot, or so she thinks. And there's a lot to be gained. Now, here's the parts that kind of throw the theory into a little bit of turmoil, a little bit of a monkey wrench. We still have a situation, even without the will of the third will found that was written when she was engaged to Alfred, the marriage itself causes the first will to be negated. And John knows that. Why there doesn't seem to be the solid motive there unless he will cause something to happen to Alfred. Haven't quite figured that one out yet, unless Alfred's next to go. But we'll just have to kind of see how that goes. What was in the second will that got burned that would have caused it to be destroyed? If it was John and Mary, right now the beneficiary is just simply her husband, Alfred. I don't see how a revision to that would have made any difference whatsoever. So that's the theory I have so far, but I will admit that there are very, very loose threads and holes happening within the very concept of the motive itself. So I am not 100%, I'm not even honestly 30-40% attached to this theory. It is still way too early in days, and I'm very curious to have some of these questions answered as we get to things and as Poirot continues investigating. So let's go ahead and get to chapter 6 and find out what's going to be happening next. Sorry, before we get to that, I just want to point out, as soon as I finished recording that, I went ahead and I Googled, what does bromide taste like? And I found this: potassium bromide, widely used as an anticonvulsant and a sedative in the late 19th and early 20th century. In a dilute aqueous solution, potassium bromide tastes sweet. At higher concentrations, it tastes bitter and tastes salty when the concentration is even higher. So if somebody wanted to just have a concentration that appears to just simply have been used as a sedative, would have tasted sweet. All the coffee tastes sweet. She doesn't take sugar in her coffee. She was drugged. All right. So that's a theory at the very least. And I have a feeling it's going to yield fruit, and Poirot is going to confirm that at some point. So let's find out for real this time. On to chapter 6. Wow. Okay, so the inquest is upon us, and we have a lot of new information. Not a lot of new evidence or clues, but a ton of testimony. And it turns out I was right about a few things and wrong about a few things, and there's so much to go over. Let's just go ahead and dive right into it. So let's take a look at the board and see some of the new stuff. Now, there's not a ton of new entries on here. We do have the letter that was written by Mrs. Inglethorpe to Evelyn, basically just, wanting to make amends. Don't really think there's a ton of hidden meaning happening in there. Evelyn seems to think that it's simply evidence of Alfred's wrongdoing. So what the real new stuff is all the bullet points of the testimony here. So let's just get into it here. We first have Dr. Bauerstein, who confirms the medical diagnosis of strychnine poisoning, probably a grain or more, so certainly not a small amount. Confirms that strychnine takes only an hour or two to take effect, and anything that delays that reaction really isn't on the board for this. So it really seems unlikely that it was due to that evening coffee, or at the very least face value of that. confirms that the cocoa has been tested and no traces of strychnine have been found, and that strychnine is bitter, so cocoa would not mask it, but coffee would. Now, strychnine is bitter, and I've already discussed that the sleeping powders can be sweet or bitter depending on the amount in there, so it kind of winds up in a place of we're still not entirely sure what it was that Poirot tasted in Cynthia's mug, but I have a feeling it was dosed with sleeping powders, and that's what made her fall asleep and so difficult to rouse. Whether it was intended for Cynthia or not, that's kind of up in the air. I'm still not entirely convinced that it was meant for her coffee cup, but we'll get to that. All right, back to the board here. Then we had Lawrence, well, first we had John testifying, but there really wasn't any new information there. Then we had Lawrence testifying, echoing the same basic statements as John, confirming the details of that evening, but then offered the possibility. He's like, wait. I just want to proffer something here. Perhaps the death was natural because apparently Mrs. Inglethorpe had been taking a tonic containing strychnine, which immediately Dr. Wilkins took the stand and dismissed the idea. If it was a long-standing kind of poisoning where a little bit was added to her coffee over a significant period of time, she would have had symptoms long ago. So this was a fairly immediate thing, and the quantities were insufficient on hand to account for such a large dose coming from the tonic. So that was kind of dismissed. But the interesting thing is, once again, we have Lawrence kind of worming his way, not wanting the investigation from Poirot, acting a little bit weaselly, and now offering a different suggestion other than purposeful murder. Perhaps there's a reason he's bringing that up. Perhaps there's a reason he doesn't want a keen eye to be looking at the prospect of murder. And perhaps that's because he was the one that did it. But let's find out. Continuing on, we have Mary testifying. Now, this is one of the portions that I was wrong. Apparently, Mary does have to testify. But again, it just seems like affirming the information that's already known. However, we did get some new information here. Apparently, the coroner did receive some information in his, investigation there, where apparently he found out that she overheard the quarrel that happened between Mrs. Inglethorpe and supposedly Mr. Inglethorpe. And she revealed that she was indeed outside the boudoir window reading on the bench, but she only heard the quarrel. She wasn't paying attention. She certainly didn't listen to the words because, oh my goodness, that's just something that we don't do. I am not in the habit of listening to private conversations, so it was completely useless in terms of actually trying to recall any of the actual quarrel. Only recalls the words scandal between husband and wife. This is all very, very suspicious. The idea that she couldn't recall any of the words, it's absolute bunk. Whether it's provable or not, well, we'll see. But for the moment, there's really no way to disprove it, so fine. It has to be accepted as tentative truth, but I don't think that anybody's buying it. I certainly am not. And I also think that the male voice being heard through the door by Dorcas was probably known to Mary and was probably able to be confirmed as not Mr. Inglethorpe, as I suspect, and continue to suspect that it was indeed John, whom Mary is protecting. So, moving on, a lot of stuff here. Okay, so Mary's testimony was a bunch of bunk and fairly useless. Then Evelyn confirms the receipt of the letter, see the clue that was posted there. Then Albert Mace comes in with some truth bombs, or possibly truth bombs. From his perspective, truth bombs. We have no real reason to believe he's lying here, but he does confirm that he works at the pharmacy and he has only worked there briefly. Okay, so that tells us that the possibility exists that he thought he saw Alfred Inglethorpe, but Poirot made a specific mention previous to this that he was excited about something that was about the fact that Alfred Inglethorpe has a big black beard and wears kind of odd styling of clothes, which kind of leads me to think that somebody could potentially dress up as Alfred Inglethorpe and portray a convincing version of him if it was somebody that didn't know him intimately, if it was somebody that was, say, new in town, just started working at the pharmacy, knew of Alfred Inglethorpe as somebody with a big black beard and dresses kind of odd. think there might be something there. But he also confirmed that he sold strychnine to Mr. Inglethorpe on the night of Monday, July 16th. And then he showed the coroner the ledger signed by Mr. Inglethorpe. Now let's take a gander here at July 16th on the grand timeline. Now I did add the Albert May sold strychnine to Mr. Inglethorpe. I am leaving it as a fact posted here that he sold strychnine to Mr. Inglethorpe, but from the point of view of Albert. Once that kind of gets a hole punched into it, which I have a feeling it will, that'll get updated. But we do have a couple of things here that we learned from previous. We have John was exhibiting restless, unusual behavior. That could be interesting. Could be something where John was fidgety about something that he was hatching, perhaps. And that Cynthia didn't return with the group and asked to join a supper party for the night. So she wasn't around. I don't know if that has anything to do with anything, but it's just the bullet point that was already posted there. And since we're taking a look at the evening of the 16th, it just bears kind of going over again. So Albert drops that massive testimony there, and everybody is eyeballing Alfred with strict eyes. And then he takes the stand and does himself absolutely no favors. He denies purchasing the strychnine. He shows that his handwriting isn't similar to the ledger, but I mean, that could be faked. Won't reveal his whereabouts on the 16th. Denies he was in the house the afternoon of the 17th during the quarrel, but won't say where he was. And then theorizes that his last words as his wife's last words as Dr. Bauerstein is similar in height and build. So she could have just simply been confusing him for Alfred in her state of the poisoning fits there. So that is kind of a little bit of an explanation in terms of why her last words were Alfred, which is something to kind of note, because if Dr. Bauerstein is the same height and build as Alfred and could possibly wear a black beard and some odd clothes, perhaps he could pass as Alfred to a chemist that was new in town and has a close relationship with Mary and wants to perhaps do her a favor if she's in tight with something with John. There's a lot of things in play here, but I do kind of think that perhaps there might be some sort of nefarious collaboration between the three of John, Mary, and Dr. Bauerstein. Possibly, but maybe not. I'm still not sold on the Dr. Bauerstein thing, just because it seems like he's really cooperating with the investigation to a very high degree. There's nothing about it, and he's in a very strong position to be able to derail it by offering false information, false facts, withholding things from the other doctors. And he's simply not doing that. He's being apparently very on board with everything. So still not quite, but the same height and build, that seems like an interesting point. A point that may come up later in the future. So let's finish this off here. Says he went to take her the coffee, but did not. Okay. And then was told that a friend was at the hall door. So he set the coffee on the hall table, and when he came back through, it was gone. And then the verdict was given: willful murder against some person or persons unknown. Now, there is one thing that I do kind of want to just point out here is he says that he did not deliver her the coffee. He put it down on the table. Now, taking a look at the dinner and coffee elements here, Mrs. Inglethorpe retires to the boudoir again. I'm taking a look at this specific portion right here. Asks Mary to bring her the coffee. Mary brings the coffee to Hastings and Cynthia. Mary asks Cynthia to take Emily her coffee. Mr. Inglethorpe offers to do it instead. Now, it could be that he was simply being a dutiful husband and says, no, let me. Lawrence follows him. Once again, we have a situation where Lawrence is acting cagey, and Mr. Inglethorpe did not deliver the coffee, but the coffee was delivered nonetheless. By whom? We know that Lawrence followed him. It was a very quick line, once again, but I think that may be Agatha Christie's attempt at subversion, at let's hide what's actually happening through a quick little line that may seem very dismissive. I'm not dismissing it. I think it's very pertinent, and God, there's something happening here. Clearly there's something happening here, and my mind is wild with theories, but the problem is I still don't have motive. We have a lot of clues. We have a lot of testimony. We have a lot of opportunity. We have a whole lot of evidence that could point towards any number of people. But the one thing that we really just don't have at this point in time is a strong motive. Not until we figure out what was actually in that will and testament that got burned. Not until we find out who was actually going to benefit from Mrs. Inglethorpe's death. If it's not Alfred, or if perhaps maybe if he does get put in jail for this, perhaps then whatever benefits he may get as the husband are null and void and then simply get passed down. That would be an interesting thing to find out. That would kind of be the interplay of inner knowledge within the legal system of Britain in the 1910s, 1920s. So if that's the case, then killing her and framing him would yield benefits, but we don't know that for certain. I don't know that for certain at the very least, and I'm kind of waiting to see how this plays out. So that's the best theory I have as far as a motive goes. Beyond that, I don't know why anybody would actually do this in the way that it has been done. So there's a lot more to kind of figure out. We do have a little bit of different things on the timeline, and this is something that I was kind of right about a few things here. So if you'll recall, I mentioned that there would have been a time period lapse between the times of when the Gardners were assigned to go fetch the blank will form and when they came back with it to witness the signing. And according to Manning, one of the Gardners, it was at 4:30. Williams says it was a little bit earlier. So this does indeed butt heads with the idea that Dorcas overheard the argument at 4 o'clock. But she maintains that. Poirot is making specific mention of maybe it was later, maybe, but she says that it was a good hour between that time that she overheard the argument and the time that tea time rang when she brought Mrs. Inglethorpe the tea at 5 o'clock. So there is a discrepancy. How could the argument have happened in terms of Mrs. Inglethorpe and Mr. Inglethorpe at the exact same time that the Gardners were there, either getting the assignment to retrieve the will or witnessing the will being signed itself? So there's a lot of questions, and that 4 o'clock portion there is a timeline discrepancy, and it seems to have Poirot scratching his head. So we are going to see what can happen as we get that sorted out, as we maybe find out who was mistaken, who was lying, who had the clock turned, with the hour hand turned up and then turned back and later for tea time. Who knows? It could be any number of things. But the one thing that I want to know is this portion right here. This is still very much an unknown. If strychnine takes an hour or two to take effect, then what happened prior to 5 o'clock? There's a whole lot in play in terms of the coffee served, but that was all at 8:30, 8 o'clock. It was just, I don't know how pertinent it is. It's a lot of questions that are on the table right now, and I love these kinds of mysteries where it's just a whole lot of information and it's a whole lot to juggle and there's a whole lot of questions, but we are in the middle of this thing, so it is questions abound and answers few and far between. So let's go ahead and move on to Chapter 7 as we hopefully start to get to the answers for these questions. So go ahead and get to reading, and I'll join you in just a moment. You'll have to pardon me. I feel very much like the cat that caught the canary. So for those of you that are wondering, yes, I am reading this one chapter at a time. I read a chapter, I make the notes, I update the board, and then I record, and then I don't move on to the next chapter until that's done. There's a few reasons for this. Number one, I want this to feel very much like an organic experience. I want this to feel like when you pause the video or come back to it later, that you're experiencing it in the same timeline as I am. This is like every revelation I want to be a revelation for us both as we read together. Second is more just logistical. I don't want to accidentally reveal something that I shouldn't yet know because I skipped ahead. And this has some downfalls to it. Number one, the biggest one I can think of is that I can only read the book as fast as I can record videos. And there is a big part of me that wants to just grab this book, head upstairs, crawl under the comforter, and just plow through it. but I have to go chapter by chapter. So, yeah, I'm pretty elated because a lot of the theories that I've already put out are correct. Or at the very least, Poirot agrees with them, which is pretty synonymous with correct. So, yeah, pretty happy with how a lot of this turned out. This was a fairly short chapter. It was only about 10 pages or so, according in my book. And it was not a lot of new evidence, not a lot of new testimony, but it was kind of drawing some lines together to come up with theories and discount other theories in a way that I've already kind of done here on my own. So let's get into some details of that as we kind of go over the moments after the inquest. So Poirot and Hastings meet up with the Scotland Yard officers, who then reveal that the doctor involved was the one that tipped them off through the coroner. They didn't specify which doctor. So it could have been Dr. Bauerstein. It could have been the family doctor. Not quite sure yet, but otherwise they wouldn't have been involved quite so early. But fortunately, one of them knows Poirot, so when he is calling on them to, perhaps delay something or at the very least hear them out, while one of them is scoffing at the concept of this very clear, open and shut case being anything other, the other one says, I will follow Poirot on this. I trust his word, so let's at least hear him out. So, in the meantime, while they're getting stuff ready together, and in about half an hour, they're going to be meeting up to go to Styles, Poirot is talking with Hastings and coming up with those kind of theories and dismissing other theories, talking about how Alfred's beard and clothes, somebody could dress up as him, especially to a chemist who is somewhat new in town. I cannot tell you how big the smile on my face was when I read that. Then remarked about Lawrence's continued caginess, and bringing up the idea that it could have been something that was still accidental or natural. Again, big smile on my face. Then this was the part that still kind of not quite sure what to make of this. Talked about how Mary's account of things was odd, and Hastings seems to agree with this. But then Poirot comes to say that it confirms Dorcas's recollection that the quarrel took place at 4 o'clock. Somehow. I don't know how. This is one that I don't have the foggiest. I have no theory whatsoever. We know that it took place in the boudoir. We know that the gardeners were in the boudoir. We know that they were there from 4 o'clock to, who knows when, around that time, to tackle the will, either acquisition of it or witnessing of it. And somehow Mary's account of hearing the quarrel, even though she gave no real information, confirms Dorcas's account of 4 o'clock. This is, I got nothing. I have absolutely nothing. I am very curious about this. And then he continues on to raise more questions, or raise some questions at the very least, about Dr. Bauerstein. Like, what was he doing fully dressed and just happened to be walking around at 5 o'clock in the morning, the morning of the death? Awfully suspicious. And then we do have the other things that are kind of suspicious about Dr. Bauerstein that do, it asks questions. It doesn't necessarily count to any kind of guiltiness, but, like, why was he covered in mud, or, caked on dried mud when he entered the house the night of the murder? What is his involvement in terms of his friendship with Mary? She didn't go on that walk with him when she was planning to. Why? What happened? Where was he? Just a bunch of other little questions that don't necessarily point to guilt, but definitely point to something there. And Poirot is seeing that something is there too. So Poirot and Hastings meet up with the Scotland Yard detectives, and they go to Styles, where Poirot finally impresses upon Alfred the gravity of the situation. Says, look, dude, all this evidence is pointing to you being the one that killed your wife. And for some reason, even hearing that in the inquest that his wife died through strychnine poisoning and somebody placed him at the chemist buying strychnine, somehow those dots weren't connected in his own head, and this was the landing blow for that. And then he finally had the gravity of, oh my goodness, people suspect me. Okay. But even so, he wouldn't talk. And then finally Poirot drops the bomb that I think a lot of people saw coming, that Alfred was out with Mrs. Raikes. I mean, really, it's not so much a revelation as much as it is a confirmation, because this is something that Evelyn's already talked about, that he spends a lot of time with Mrs. Raikes. And even Hastings got told this prior to the inquest, the day before on Thursday, when he ran into the aged rustic local who confirms that Poirot has been visiting Raikes' farm several times. Clearly, he was inquiring about Alfred Inglethorpe's business at the Raikes' farm. It seems like a foregone conclusion, but again, this isn't necessarily a revelation as much as it is a confirmation. So yeah, we have an alibi with 5 witnesses confirming the time. So whomever bought the strychnine, it wasn't Alfred, which I don't think necessarily points to innocence. I mean, I do think that he's innocent. I'm just talking about the evidence as presented doesn't necessarily exonerate him. However, in a web of tangled lines, it does manage to cut one of them that was pointing fairly squarely at him. So the rest could unravel from there with not too much effort. So fair point. And I'm kind of curious to see where Poirot goes from here. Again, this was a fairly short chapter. Not a lot really presented in terms of new clues, new evidence, anything along those lines. But I'm so happy that some of my theories proved to yield fruit. So I'm very curious. Let's move on to the next chapter. I'll see you in a bit. Let's get to reading. So I got the wind taken out of my sails a little bit. There are going to be chapters in which I am right about a few things, and then there's going to be chapters in which I am wrong. And such was the case with chapter 8. Now, I mentioned that I really couldn't see a whole lot gelling in terms of the motive, and I was wrong on a few fronts on that one. First of all, I don't know why. I just didn't think of it. If Alfred's found guilty, he would be hung. Okay, so now, if Alfred was the beneficiary, that would kind of take care of it toot sweet. So my idea in terms of not really knowing the procedures as far as the 1910s, 1920s England rules of legal passing down, if somebody got arrested, then they would no longer be eligible for it, kind of goes out the window. He'd be hung. He'd be dead. Done. Second of all, probably even more important in all honesty, something that was brought up in a previous chapter that I kind of glossed over. I didn't quite understand it, and something in chapter 8 did make me kind of break it down a little bit further and realize that there is indeed motive, even if that weren't the case. Even if Alfred is exonerated, which we already have established that he is. So motive is still in play, and I'll get to that in just a little bit, but there was some clarity in terms of estates and wills and so on. Lastly, I was also deflated when I just got done saying that I didn't really suspect Dr. Bauerstein of necessarily the murder because he had been so forthright with the investigation. Got a little bit of the stool kicked out from under me right there. So let's go ahead and take a look at all the things that happened in chapter 8 and all the ways in which I was wrong. So Poirot has Hastings stand by the baize door. What is the baize door? Well, I went ahead and looked that up, and in this era, the Jane Austen, Downton Abbey type era here, the baize door is a dividing line between two domains, in this case, the servants' quarters doors. So we're talking about, in the map here, this door right here. So he has Hastings stand right over here while he goes into Mrs. Inglethorpe's room. Poirot goes into Mrs. Inglethorpe's room and knocks over the table. And Hastings didn't hear a thing. So That got me thinking, well, why is that important? And fortunately, things were still kind of fresh in my head, and it became immediately obvious why that was important. Was Mary Cavendish just got done explaining in the inquest that it was her waking up with the table being knocked over at 4:30 in the morning that set off things into motion. She was the one that woke up. She listened outside of her door, but her room is even further away than the Bay's door. So if Hastings couldn't hear anything just standing out in the hallway, how could Mary have heard anything from the enclosed portion of her room even further away? So Mary's lying about that, and Poirot knows that now, although he seems crestfallen. So maybe he doesn't want Mary to... I know that Hastings has an unnatural kind of attraction or, what have you to Mary, but I don't know. It could just be a ploy or something that Poirot is kind of putting a face on her. It could just be not necessarily wanting to see the worst in humanity and being sad when confronted by the possibility of it and the fact that he's been lied to. Whatever. But yeah, Mary's lying. We know that now. And Poirot was testing that. So that's been established. Hastings finally tells Poirot that Dr. Bauerstein was present the afternoon of the murder, caked in mud. I kind of assumed that this was part of the verbal dump that Hastings put onto Poirot when he was explaining everything when he first hired him on, but apparently this missed that, and Poirot now knows it and is suitably excited by it and immediately makes arrangements for a vehicle to take them into town, where once they arrive, he drops off a sample of the cocoa to be tested and says, when Hastings says, but Dr. Bauerstein already confirmed it, Poirot says, Bauerstein said that there was nothing in there, clearly indicating that he suspects Dr. Bauerstein of lying about the results of the cocoa or even getting any results whatsoever in the first place. So my whole thing about Dr. Bauerstein being above board with this investigation and not tampering with anything or lying about anything in terms of, playing well with the test results, yeah, I was wrong. Clearly I was wrong. And I think we can all kind of guess what the test results are going to come back with that cocoa. I don't know about strychnine. It could be something. I don't know, because of the whole bitter sweet thing. We will see. But yeah, clearly strychnine would have been detected in the cocoa. We've already established that. So what's in there? Was it more sleeping powders? And then the thought also occurred to me, what if Cynthia had drugged herself with the sleeping powders? Because then it would be a situation where, she didn't take sugar in her coffee, but when she tasted something sweet, as the coffee would have been, she didn't say anything about it because she knew it was like, so she took a nightcap thing, and perhaps to force herself to sleep for some reason, plausible deniability. I don't know. Lots of thoughts drifting around. Let's stop with the thoughts and let's get back into the board. Hastings and Poirot confer on the drive over to get the cocoa tested, where Hastings draws the admittedly far-fetched theory of Mrs. Howard being the suspect, and Poirot dismisses that for a number of reasons, mostly because he already confirmed her alibi at the hospital where she works, but praises Hastings on the idea that anybody could be a suspect and nobody should be ruled out until they have been ruled out with sufficient evidence to satisfy the investigator at hand, which Hastings kind of just throws to the wind when he assumes John to be above suspicion, and Poirot clearly disagrees with that, not in any kind of overt sense. He's not pointing the finger at him, but when Hastings makes the assumptions that John is above suspicions, Poirot is clearly not entirely on board with that. He's not confirming that in the slightest. And then Poirot instructs Hastings to meet with Lawrence privately and tell him, find the extra coffee cup and you can rest in peace. And he wants it said exactly like that. Nothing more, nothing less. We still haven't seen that happen. I'm kind of curious what was going to occur when that does. Is it a situation where the cup has some poison remnants in it, so rest in peace means it's associated with death? Or is it a situation where Lawrence feels like there's some fingers being pointed at him and he needs something to exonerate him. So, I mean, like, rest in peace in terms of get a good night's sleep. You're fine. You don't worry about it. This is like something that is causing him worry that he doesn't want to worry about. So what is with the extra coffee cup? Is it the cup that got spilled when the table got knocked over and the brown coffee stain happened by the window? I assumed that was the cup that was like maybe smashed to powder over by the other table, but perhaps not. Perhaps there is another coffee cup. Perhaps it's a situation where that was the thing that Lawrence saw on the mantle, a coffee cup sitting there, and it could be something that, he recognized should not be there, recognized as something that was, potentially ghastly. And when Hastings turned around and didn't see anything, why would he have noticed a coffee cup? It would have just been another fixture in the room. So it was something that was technically there that both of them saw, but only Lawrence recognized it as something potentially problematic. That's possible. I just thought of that as I was speaking. That's interesting. Okay, back to the board. That was moments after. So that was still the same day. That was all July the 20th, the Friday. Then the following day, July 21st, the Saturday, we have Mrs. Inglethorpe's funeral. And then 2 days after that, we have July 23rd, Monday. This day, John takes Hastings aside, says Alfred is leaving to take up quarters at Stylites Arms for a while. Everybody kind of feels bad about pointing the finger at him, and things are just kind of a little bit awkward and uncomfortable. And I'm assuming Stylites Arms is either a different manor or possibly even just a hotel that Alfred is going to be staying at for the foreseeable future. But either way, it seems like everybody's just relieved that he's going to be making a graceful exit. John then affirms that Styles was not his mother's to give, and that upon her death, his late father's property falls to him, while Lawrence gets a considerable sum of money from his father's will. John also gets money from his stepmother's estate to keep up the property. So this is the other thing that I was wrong about in terms of the motive and the thing that I needed clarity on that the other chapter kind of touched on. And it actually, you know what? It spelled it out. I just missed it. I'm going to cop to that. So this kind of goes towards my ignorance of how things are kind of passed down. So as far as I understand it, just kind of breaking it down into really explain like I'm five kind of wordings here. When the two boys' father passed, his will entrusted Styles to John and a considerable sum of money to Lawrence, but only upon their stepmother's death. Emily's will previously had specified that some money would go to John to keep up the property. So even if it was a situation where Alfred got exonerated or he was still alive and just otherwise in the picture, and the will and testament as it had been, any of the number 1 or number 3 wills, even negated through marriage, the father's will would still have passed down to the boys. So they still stand to inherit what their father left them if their stepmother passes. Okay, so that's established. So they do have something to gain, and we know that both of them are kind of in dire straits with finances, and we kind of get alluded to that John actually owes people money. Then we have Dorcas mentioning to Hastings the dressing up box in the attic. Would you please tell Poirot this next time you see them? Which is just a massive bomb to drop. Poirot and Hastings go up into the attic. They look through the dressing up box to look for the green fabric that would match the threads found in the door bolt. They come up a little dry on that, but they do find a black beard, a costume beard that was trimmed to be Alfred's beard length. Dorcas then talks to them about their dress-up nights and confirms that Lawrence did use the beard previously. So we have a lot of new information there. And lastly, Poirot says that he needs an ally in the house. He needs eyes, and he needs somebody that is not Hastings. He needs somebody that is known to not be working with Poirot, but somebody that would be on their side, and somebody that would be intelligent, and somebody that could, have some good eyes out as they watch over the goings-on of the house. So the best and most obvious answer for Poirot is Miss Howard. And he confronts her and gets her to admit that as much as she wants to put the screws to Alfred, she has to admit that the evidence says no. And the only reason that she really is deadlocked on that and won't let it go is her instinct is telling her that it is somebody else, and she just simply does not want to believe that. Her instincts are telling her that it is somebody unthinkable. And Poirot is confirming those instincts, and she is breaking down, not wanting to see it. But he finally gets her to relent, gets her to see that justice must be done, and she finally agrees that she will indeed be his eyes around the house and be an ally to him. And then Hastings is now sullen and promises to keep him to himself any findings from Poirot for the opportunity to surprise him with his intelligence later, which just seems absolutely folly and is going to be very interesting to see how that shakes out in the near future, because that is going to kind of make our protagonist, our eyes and ears, a bit of an unreliable narrator. If he's keeping things from the investigator, who knows how much of a monkey wrench that's going to be throwing into the works. We already know that Poirot not having the information about Dr. Bauerstein being there caked in mud the afternoon of the murder was a massive blow of a lack of information that once that got filled in just set things into motion. So who knows what pulling back on information is going to do next. So what does this do to any new theories of mine? Well, honestly, a whole lot. We do kind of get put back into play with the whole John and Mary situation in terms of who could have been having the argument, with John potentially there and Mary potentially protecting him in the quarrel with Mrs. Inglethorpe, and Dr. Bauerstein could have been the one helping them. Dr. Bauerstein, again, you know, if he's going to be somebody that is being suspected, then we have to go back to the fact that he is an expert on poisons. He does have access. And maybe it's also another situation where if Cynthia was drugged, perhaps it was something to get access to her keys so that somebody could access the poison cabinet at her work, and which would implicate Lawrence. Honestly, I have suspicions for almost everybody all over again. The whole world's opened up and everybody could benefit. Everybody's a suspect. And I got to agree with Poirot, which just seems like the safe bet. And I hate to do that, but it feels like to me that Miss Howard is the only one that is above suspicion. Even Cynthia herself, although I think it's unlikely, could be somebody that's in play. Either somebody actively did it or somebody helped them, but everybody has the opportunity, everybody has the motive for one or the other. So at this point, let's go ahead and stop with the theorizing and get to the reading. So chapter 9 awaits, and I look forward to seeing what's going to be happening there. And I also look forward to talking to you in just a moment. See you soon. Chapter 9, Dr. Bauerstein, or as I like to call it, Hastings, what the fuck are you doing? So I'm recording this the next day, and my hair, I got out of the shower. I kind of did that purposefully. I could have continued recording. I did read the chapter yesterday, but I kind of wanted to take a moment and pause here because, as we know, the end of the chapter, Hastings finds out that Dr. Bauerstein was arrested, and we're coming up on kind of the 2/3 point in things, and I just felt like I wasn't really in a place of good standing until I could actually start coming up with a little bit more theories other than everybody. So I did want to kind of meditate on it and sleep on it. So I do have a little bit more of kind of a gelled theory in terms of possibilities of what happened, who some suspects might be. It's not firm yet, but it's a little bit better than I was grasping at straws yesterday with. So let's dig into the content of this chapter. We have Hastings delivers the message to Lawrence, who seems legitimately confused. And at lunch, Poirot asked Mrs. Cavendish if she was sure the door between Mrs. Inglethorpe's room and Cynthia's was bolted. She was unsure. She just knew that it was locked for certain. They couldn't get in. So I'm assuming this is a situation where each of the doors has a lock mechanism for either entry, but also has a bolt just on the inside that would prevent anybody from opening it unless they were on the inside. Lawrence chimed in, he followed up asking if Mrs. Inglethorpe's room was bolted, presumably the door to the hallway. It didn't specify, and I kind of hate that because we're talking about 3 different doors here. Could he have talked about, the Cynthia door once again, but perhaps bolted from the other side, if that's even possible? What if he was talking about Alfred's room? The fact that it wasn't specified leads me to think that it was just generally the door to her room, i.e. from the hallway. And Mary wasn't sure, but Lawrence chimed in and said that it was. Hastings relays Lawrence's confusion to Poirot, who confirmed that that's what he thought would happen as far as the, spare cup, rest in peace kind of thing. And, that's what I thought. Okay. And then Poirot mentions to Hastings that he would like to visit Cynthia at her place of work, asks about the poison cabinet, if it was near the window. Hastings confirms that it's not, but it is on the other side of the room. This kind of led me, there's a little birdie outside. Hi, little birdie. Sorry. Squirrel. Got distracted. Anyway, this kind of leads into some of my theory in terms of what actually happened in that room between the hours of 8:30 and 5 o'clock. So we'll dig into that just as soon as we finish with a little synopsis here. Hastings continues on without Poirot and falls asleep by a tree, waking up to witness John and Mary having an argument about her spending time with Dr. Bauerstein. She mentions, "Have you no friends of whom I should disapprove?" which raises his ire. And then John asks if she loves Dr. Bauerstein. "Perhaps," she replies, and then she walks away, leaving John alone. So this gets me to thinking, what friends does John have of whom Mary should not approve? And there's only one that really comes to mind, and that's Hastings. The notion that, she would not approve of him for a number of reasons, but I think the one that might be primarily on the table at this point is the fact that he is working with Poirot in this investigation, which, if Mary is guilty of anything, makes him a bit of an enemy, and that she and John both know that, and she is disapproving of things vocally. Hastings then makes his presence known to John, snaps a twig, does a and John complains about the scandal and the public scrutiny. Still seems to be friendly with Hastings. Hastings suddenly finds tenuous links between Dr. Bauerstein and the investigation, and informs John of this, even saying Poirot suspects him, which is just point number 1 on what the hell are you doing, Hastings? I know that he doesn't suspect John, which is folly in and of itself, but to bring anybody in on it without while making incredible assumptions of innocence just seems absolutely silly. The idea that he would speak for Poirot, Poirot asks questions, certainly, but that doesn't necessarily mean he suspects him of the murder. Maybe even if John was innocent, who's to say that John wouldn't relay that information and kind of gab and blab about it to somebody that shouldn't have that? Hastings is taking somebody into his confidence that is not entirely appropriate for an ongoing investigation. And man, what the hell are you thinking? Hastings suddenly also thinks silently that there may be an accomplice in Mary. Unfortunately, he thinks this silently, doesn't say it out loud, doesn't relay it to John. That's like one good move that he actually did there. And then John continues to find faults in his reasoning, picking holes in all the various ways in which the possibility can happen there. And in this particular instance, it does make me kind of feel for Hastings, because in his conversations with Poirot and frustrations that Poirot is holding information close to his chest and not bringing Hastings in on it, Poirot has said, you have all the facts. All the facts that are involved in this are presented in front of you. Whether you have the instinct to tie them together and actually come up with the threads that actually really matter between the facts, that's up to you. With Hastings doing this theorizing of Dr. Bauerstein, well, if this had happened, and if this and this and this, it all seemed really, really flimsy, but then I also kind of like, well, I'm kind of doing the same thing. I supposedly have all the facts, and I am somewhat floundering with the threads to put them together. I do think I made a little bit more progress than Hastings, but I mean, we'll see. I'm probably going to be proven wrong. But I mean, that's the fun thing about these. And that's one of the fun things that I like about this idea for this video series is I do kind of wonder as I'm going through these books, if I'm going to be getting better and better, not at necessarily deducing the crimes as a true mystery detective, but more kind of just understanding the workflows and patterns that Agatha Christie may be injecting into her books so that I can actually see some things kind of pop up so that by the 50th book of hers, I may be a whole lot better at it than I am right now, but we'll see. We'll see if that growth happens. Even so, let's just, really quickly finish off the rest of the synopsis here. So John continues to find fault in his reasoning. Then we have the garden picnic, and Hastings tells Cynthia that Poirot would like a tour of her work, and she agrees excitedly. She thinks that's a fantastic idea. She's all about it. And then Hastings and Cynthia go for a walk together, and she confides that she's scared there's nowhere for her to go and that the household hates her. John accepted, but for the most part, she just feels like she is there for the, until the investigation is over and, perhaps a little longer. She was under Mrs. Inglethorpe's wing, and now Mrs. Inglethorpe is clearly not in the picture anymore. So she's kind of worried about her future. She doesn't know what to do. And then Hastings proposes to her. Point number 2 of Hastings, what the fuck are you doing? Oh man, that came right out of nowhere. Holding a book and laughing, which made me feel a little better when Cynthia started laughing, and that's exactly what she did, and caused him to be a little bit crestfallen and says, it's not what you want, it's not what I want, it's not what either of us want. It's no, definitely no. And then after that, Hastings goes on to check with Dr. Bauerstein and then finds out that he has been arrested, and that's the end of the chapter. So, as far as my new theories, and as far as the clues that kind of got me there, I just had to take a little bit of a step back, and I came up with a few new portions of the board here, and it's not really anything new, it's just kind of the same information, but perhaps visually presented a little bit differently, because I was kind of struggling. This was a situation where it wasn't a lack of information. It was a situation of way too much information and trying to sift through it and then try to put pieces together, not knowing what's an actual piece and what's red herring. It's just been so much. And that's honestly one of the things I love about this, but I did have to get my thoughts together just a little bit more. So I did come up with this little, just bits. It's just tidbits. It's not necessarily even notes. It's just tidbits. Dr. Bauerstein covered with mud. It was a sunny, warm day. Someone bought strychnine to frame Alfred. Access to the poison cabinet in Cynthia's workplace. Mary did not go on the planned walk with Bauerstein, was upset. And I'm sure there's a whole lot more bits than this, but I kind of made a point of some stuff that either interested Poirot or interested me when I read about it. And I kind of just came up with like this persons of interest thing here, and I haven't really filled it out. I'm still not entirely sure how this is going to shake out. I'm not sold on this format, but I did kind of want to just put the persons of interest out there of Dr. Bauerstein, Mary, Cynthia, John, and Lawrence. And I'm generally thinking Cynthia is not necessarily a person of interest. She is probably my least likely involved with this. And I have a few reasons for that. Number one, the possibility exists that the will that was burned benefited Cynthia. Cynthia was taken, like I said, under Mrs. Inglethorpe's wing. She was her protege and she was training her. And I would imagine that the will, as it was written, as it had stood, John was to get the property from his father's estate. Lawrence was to get money from his father's estate, and John was to get a tidy sum to maintain the property from his mother's estate. So the only real action that her will could have done that would have impacted either of them would be to cut John out. Lawrence was going to get what he was going to get from his father anyway. She had no control over Styles and whether to give it or not. The only thing she really had control over was the tidy sum that was going to be given to John for the upkeep of Styles. And John, being in debt and seeming to be like owing money to debtors or bookies or whomever, would care more about money than the property. So if Mrs. Inglethorpe had cut John out in that news of whatever, then who would she have benefited? And Poirot had even mentioned that it would be somebody along the same, when Hastings was theorizing about Miss Howard, he was saying, I don't think that she would have benefited, but somebody along that kind of, lateral positioning. And that got me thinking of Cynthia, her protege, somebody that she would have believed, had money, was conned out of it with terrible circumstances, hard worker, does work for the hospital, is helping the war effort in that way, make her the beneficiary. So that's why I'm thinking that Cynthia was the beneficiary of the will that got burned. And in that was not a person of interest in terms of any motivation to actually have Mrs. Inglethorpe killed, whereas John would be. And in terms of the whole thing about the scandal between husband and wife, that also implicates Mary. And Mary's friendship with Dr. Bauerstein implicates him. So I'm not discounting Lawrence from this, but I have nothing really binding to tie him into anything other than just kind of some odd behavior. I mean, there are just, one or two little flecks of anything, but it's not really leading to anything. It's certainly not with any motive in place. So let's take a look at the room here again and look at what we have. So we have the window here with the brown stain of coffee here and the table with the loose top. We have the chest of drawers where the cocoa was placed, and we have the table that was overturned and the candle grease. What I'm thinking, here is my current theory, and I'm leaving kind of people out of it. I'm just kind of explaining what my theory is on the events of that evening, is that there was two different aspects of what went on. There was the reality and there was the aesthetic, the presented as reality. So what do I mean by that? It's the same thing as somebody framing Alfred in buying the strychnine. My theory is that Mrs. Inglethorpe wasn't poisoned by strychnine, or possibly was, but nevertheless, that there was a certain aspect of things that were done for the visual aspect of it, that there was no reason for somebody to have bought strychnine on the down low, but dressed up as Alfred. That was purposeful. That was an acting performance. That was to frame Alfred. That was to put him in the crosshairs. If it was a different poison, then we would have Dr. Bauerstein potentially covering that up. And that could be done fairly easily since he was involved with the investigation. And it could also be why he's arrested now. So he might not have committed the murder, but we definitely think he probably had a hand in it, or hand in the cover-up and the planning. So we have that level of the visual framing of Alfred, but what if the poison came elsewhere? What if it came from the medicine cabinet at this hospital where Cynthia works? Well, then it would behoove somebody to take her key, potentially drug her, knock her out, take her key, go to the cabinet and the poison for the hospital, snag whatever actual poison they were going to be using, and then also have it so that if we're going to do a performance of Alfred buying the poison, why not also have a performance of Alfred poisoning Mrs. Inglethorpe, poisoning his wife? So if we're talking about darkness, the kind of darkness where somebody is walking around with a candle, spilling candle grease on the floor, potentially going over to the window to open it. That's one aspect of this that I'm not sure of. I don't know if these windows open. That's a sticking point for me, and that's kind of ruining a little bit of my theory if they don't open, but it's not specified. So I really don't know. But let's just say that they're fumbling around in the dark and they spill candle grease on the floor. And they also knock over the table, spilling the coffee. Then it could be a situation where Mrs. Inglethorpe wakes up to the sound of the table crashing and sees, by all accounts, in the dark, a black-bearded man who she thinks is her husband. Hence the last words that she spoke, Alfred, Alfred. She thinks that her husband did this, whatever it may be. She has drawn those lines together because that's exactly what they wanted to happen. That was the visual, aesthetic reality that they were trying to fabricate, where in actual reality, it may have been something far less grandiose. It could have been something where the cocoa was indeed poisoned with whatever the secondary poison may have been. And, she may have chased Alfred out of the room and bolted the door. Like, he may have gone out through his door, door B here. And after he left, what are you doing? Waking me up, knocking over my table, what the hell? Bolted the door after him, where she didn't notice that the cocoa had been poisoned at that point. And while she's up, as she typically would, as it's already been confirmed in the middle of the night, takes the cocoa. It could also be that the cocoa was pre-poisoned ahead of time through the methodology of what we've already kind of talked about with Emily setting the cocoa out on the table here before. So the cocoa could have been poisoned. The only reason that we don't think it is because of Dr. Bauerstein's word, and we've already known that that's not really worth a whole lot anymore. So this whole thing could be hinged on the test results that Poirot got back, which could show the cocoa was poisoned and the poison wasn't strychnine. So that's my theory. That's what I generally think happened. There's a lot of unknowns still in play with this. There's what did Lawrence see by the fireplace that scared him so much? Why would Lawrence be involved in all? What would he see there? Why was the cup smashed by the table that was overturned? Who overturned the table? Was it something to kind of purposefully draw out the alibi of why Mary woke up? A lot of questions still in play. Why was the case? Why was the key in the case? Who took what out? Was it the will that got burned? Okay, well, if that's the the case, then why was it forced open later while Poirot was in the house? Was it to put something back that shouldn't have been in there? Was it to take something out that maybe it was the third will that was planted? There's a lot of unknowns still in play, but we still have a good portion of the book. But that's my best theory as far as what happened that evening so far. And I'm very curious to see how much I got right. And to find that out, we need to continue reading. So that's what I'm going to do. I invite you to do the same. And let's move on to chapter 10. All right. I did not see that coming. Dr. Bauerstein is a spy. So there's always an element of these mystery novels that some people find frustrating, in that the new information comes out in such a way that could not have ever been anticipated. It really, it's not far-fetched within the context of the novel. It is far-fetched within the context of the idea that we could have come to that conclusion ourselves way ahead of time. If I had said, by chapter 5 or 6 that I believe Dr. Bauerstein is a spy, I would not have enough evidence to support that. So yeah, it's coming out with new stuff, and that's just the nature of this. And you kind of got to roll with the punches and take the new information as it comes. So let's get into some of the details and kind of just bullet point a lot of what happened here, because it's a fair bit. So Poirot goes to meet Hastings at Styles. Hastings was going to go, and Poirot's already at the window, so cool. Poirot is unknowledgeable but unsurprised at the arrest of Dr. Bauerstein and explains that he was a spy. Poirot suspects Mary never cared about Dr. Bauerstein, but instead cares for someone else. So with the whole Dr. Bauerstein thing potentially being an accomplice to this murder, that seems to kind of be thrown out the window. He just doesn't seem like he would implicate himself in anything like that if he was a spy. If he was just there to gather intel for the enemy or for another nation, then that would just be putting himself in way too risky of a position. Like, he needs to be under the radar, walking around at night, fully clothed, and just gathering information, gleaning whatever Mary is gossiping about. As far as Mary not caring about Dr. Bauerstein, I don't doubt it, but it does make me wonder why she spent so much time with him. What were they talking about on their long walks? And more importantly, what use was he to her? And the only thing I can think is information about his specialty field, that she was able to get some information from him about poisons. That's the best I got as far as that goes. Miss Howard delivers the brown paper she recovered from on top of the wardrobe, found to be from theatrical costumers, addressed to, fairly agreed upon, but still a little vague, L. Cavendish. The L, certainly not a J. And let's be honest, that's the only Cavendish that's alive. That's, it's Lawrence and John. That's it. So if it's not John, it's Lawrence. So then Poirot knows how the murder was committed, but has no proof, which at that point has him excitedly run to Dorcas and asks if Monday, specifically not Tuesday, anything was wrong with Mrs. Inglethorpe's bell. And Dorcas confirms that yes, indeed there was. The wires were nibbled through, likely by a mouse or something, and a man came Tuesday morning to fix it, at which Poirot is elated, jumping around, skipping around, happy as a clam. Mary sees Poirot skipping around, and Hastings informs her it's something about a bell. This is getting me thinking, like, specifically Monday. We had the chapter 2 or 3, that was July 16th and 17th. And July 16th was very quick. Not a whole lot seemed to happen. They had the celebration, and a few little odds and ends kind of happened, and that was about it. We did also find out later that the 16th, Monday, was the day that somebody went and purchased the strychnine from the pharmacy, dressed up as Alfred. So we're getting a little bit more information, even though Tuesday was the bulk of that chapter, about what happened Monday. And again, this is just kind of really speaking to, this is where we get all the information, but this little tidbit of information that we glossed over really quickly was pretty important. And there's probably a reason that we went through it really quickly. So I kind of went back and looked at a few things there, and I had to amend some things on the board. So looking back at Monday, I added, further Monday, I added that, okay, so we already had John had unusual restless behavior, and Cynthia didn't return with the group and asked a supper party for the night with the acting group that she was with. And I already had put in Albert May sold strychnine to Mr. Inglethorpe, according to Albert. And then I also added Mrs. Inglethorpe took the last of the sleeping powders. I added this because it really kind of got me to thinking about why specifically Poirot was asking about Monday. And then I kind of remembered that, okay, so we confirmed that she didn't take the sleeping powders the night of her death because she was out. And I went back and read that and saw that she was out because she had taken it 2 days prior. Being said by, I think it was Dorcas, possibly Alice, Wednesday, the day that the kind of preliminary Poirot investigation was happening, and 5 a.m. Mrs. Inglethorpe died. So 2 days prior to Wednesday is Monday, which means Mrs. Inglethorpe took the last of the sleeping powders that day. And if her bell was cut and she took sleeping powders, and Tuesday she woke up late, slept in, why? That never really got explained. And then it was, she seemed to be happy, seemed to be, bright and chipper, as one would do if you slept in that much. And it was only after the luncheon, when everybody kind of got back to the house and, Mrs. Inglethorpe had kind of broken away from the group, that something was very, very wrong. This got me thinking about my idea that there were overlapping events that happened in the room, in terms of the sleeping powders and in terms of the broken table and in terms of Mrs. Zinglethorpe's bell being cut, I still don't really have a whole lot of like solid theories, but it does get me questioning exactly how many events actually happened in that room, not just the night of the murder, but also possibly Monday night. If somebody wanted to knock Mrs. Zinglethorpe out with some sleeping powders and do something to that room, possibly open the window or, jimmy the window open so that it could be opened at night. And that was another thing that I kind of thought of in my little bits portion in terms of it was a sunny, warm day. That would also allude to the idea that it would also be a very warm night. And if the windows do open, then perhaps Mrs. Zinglethorpe slept with them open the night of her death. But bell cut, sleeping powders taken, she was knocked out. What happened in her room that night? The night previous to the night of the murder, and how many overlapping events actually went on? I don't know. I just thought it was a good question. So that was something that I added based on the information that kind of jarred when I got all this. So that was everything that I kind of conjured about the whole bell thing. I'm still not entirely, gelled up on that, but the idea that the bell thing happened the same night that she took the sleeping powders and slept in the next morning was a little, it raised some flags. So then Mary and Hastings talk, and I'm kind of thinking that perhaps this entire talk is spurred by the idea that now she knows that Poirot knows about the bell. So now she has to have a talk with Hastings, with, whom she's been, I guess friendly enough, but, hasn't really confided in. But this time she confides in him greatly, acts as a confidant, reveals that she's not happy in her marriage. And it was always a matter of mutual convenience, but increasing distance, that she married John to get out of something. She told him right up front that she liked him, but didn't love him, and hopefully would like him more down the line, but that proved to just simply not be the case. Her father was English, her mother was Russian. Mother died when she was a child, overdose of sleeping draught. Interesting. Says she plans to leave John and depart from Styles, that she wants to be free. And she also said that John informed her about Dr. Bauerstein's death earlier, which could also be the reason that this whole conversation is being spurned. If Poirot knows about the bell and she knows that Dr. Bauerstein was arrested, then what could possibly come to light of that is causing her to do this confiding in Hastings all of a sudden? It bears questioning. The fourth letter becomes accounted for. If you recall, the night of the murder, Mrs. Zinglethorpe wrote 4 letters. We've only accounted for where the first 3 went to, and the fourth has been unaccounted for. Well, now it has been. Correspondence received from a French music publisher acknowledging Mrs. Zinglethorpe's check and confirming, sadly, that they were unable to trace a series of Russian folk songs. Once again, Mary's mother was Russian, died of sleeping draught. I don't know where this whole thing is going, but there does seem to be a bit of a tie-in there. Hastings finds that Poirot went to the dispensary on the day that Cynthia wouldn't be there, so he confirmed that, Cynthia has the day off on Wednesdays, and lo and behold, Poirot makes the boneheaded mistake of going there when Cynthia wouldn't be there. Oh, what a mistake that was, except we all know that it really wasn't. He specifically wanted to be there when Cynthia wasn't. So my idea that Cynthia is not a person of interest is starting to kind of have some wavering happen there. I don't know, but if Poirot's leaving her out, it must be for a reason. But perhaps it was a situation where he really wanted to take a very, very close look at things in a way that he probably wouldn't have been able to get away with if Cynthia had been with him. But anybody else, he could probably pull the wool over their eyes, which he seemed to have done. So then after lunch later on, Lawrence pulls Hastings aside and says, "I think I found the extra coffee cup." So apparently he did kind of know what it was talking about. There's some code that's happening there I'm not entirely certain about. But yeah, man, there's so much nebulous information just floating around out there. I'm so excited to see how this gels. I just wish I had a better wrangle on it right now. But man, it's so much. And the theories that I had are starting to kind of unravel a little bit. Hastings goes to see Poirot, who is distraught. He seems to be at a crossroads, knowing who the criminal is, but that it would cost a woman's happiness if he were to complete the investigation. Now, that could mean that he knows that the person that committed the murder is a woman, and it's going to cost her happiness if he were to have her arrested. Perhaps he knows that the murder was not necessarily justified, but perhaps some level of sympathetic, and doesn't want her to be arrested, cost her happiness for something that could be potentially viewed as understandable. Or it could simply be that the arrested party would upend somebody's life, take the, financial or happiness future away from them as collateral damage. After that, Poirot shows Hastings a series of 3 fingerprints, the first of which was Lawrence, the second of which was Cynthia, and the third of which he revealed to be a match to the first one, so Lawrence's, and then he said that he retrieved it from a bottle of strychnine that he saw at the dispensary, and seems to indicate that Lawrence touched that bottle very cleanly at some point. And then immediately after that, Mary calls on Hastings at Poirot's house. All 3 walk back to Styles and then finds that John has been arrested. Yeah, a lot happening, some of which I don't think there was any way to really anticipate or see. And if anybody had drawn those lines, I think they would have been just the flimsiest things in the world. I'm talking about Dr. Bauerstein being a spy, of course. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time theorizing, or, I think I've kind of put a few things together, but things are just so nebulous at this point. The one theory that I do have, and it's not regarding the entire murder, it's simply a small component of it that's revealed with this whole fingerprint thing in regards to Lawrence's fingerprint on the strychnine bottle, is perhaps it's not quite what we think. Perhaps it's a situation where the thing that he saw on the fireplace mantle that scared him so much the night of Mrs. Inglethorpe's death was that bottle, and he recognized it from the cabinet during the tour with Cynthia, and perhaps there's something going on there. Perhaps he and Cynthia have a relationship. Perhaps John and Cynthia have relationships. Perhaps something along those lines. Clearly, Lawrence is involved in some way. He's worn the beard before. He signed off on the costuming thing. One of the things about the overlapping events that happened in the room that perhaps was tied in with the murder, perhaps led up to the murder, perhaps was part of the evidence that was given with the letter that Mrs. Inglethorpe was distraught about. But something happened there where if Lawrence saw that bottle and was scared for Cynthia because he recognized it, he might have grabbed it in the commotion and then put it back at the dispensary, leaving his being the last fingerprints that were visible on it, and in a mixture of fingerprints, including Cynthia's. So that's one theory that I have right there, but that's pretty much all I got. I would be curious to see if anybody else has any theories that are a lot more solid than mine at this point. But for me, I just want to get through and start with the next chapter and see what continues gelling from here. I don't know that I'm going to solve this case ahead of the big reveal. I am really questioning that at this point, and I don't think that's going to happen, but we'll see. Maybe I'll get there at the 11th hour, and just before the big reveal, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what it was. Let's get to the next chapter and find out. I'm going to get to reading, you're going to get to reading, and we'll meet up in a little bit. Talk to you soon. I'm going to keep this one a bit short. So I haven't updated the board, and I'm not going to update the board with this new chapter, just because this entire chapter seemed to be based around new evidence and new testimony and everything for the trial that's happening in the arrest of John. And all of that seems to just be not necessarily red herrings, but muddling things even more. We have all the evidence as far as what happened on the 16th and 17th, or we think we do at the very least. Anything beyond that is going to just be potentially planted, potentially manufactured, and very potentially irrelevant. So I'm not going to bother with that. What I will say is I'm very curious about Poirot. I don't necessarily believe that he thinks John did this, even though that's what he's telling Hastings. This could be a situation where he suspects John and other people, one of which primarily would be Mary. Poirot has purposefully kept things from Hastings because of his friendship with John. And Hastings has not made it any kind of secret how he feels about Mary. It would stand to reason that Poirot would be holding information back from Hastings in regards to that, especially with how supportive Mary has been on the surface level in the defense of her husband. If they had been working together, it could very easily be a situation where if John is prosecuted, then it would be on the basis of evidence that would also implicate her. So it's in her best interest to defend him and get him acquitted. I don't really have a whole lot going on in terms of theory, but I do, there are some aspects of what I just talked about in terms of theories that were potentially unraveled. We have Lawrence that was admitting to taking the bottle out of the case during the tour, the strychnine bottle out of the poison case. That could simply be him covering. There's a lot of potential lies that's going around right now. And I don't necessarily believe anything that anybody said in that box in terms of Lawrence, Dr. Bauerstein, Mary, or John. With this trial, it seems like they're basically playing to get the outcome that is most desired. And I wouldn't doubt that any or all of them are lying to get there. And there are still, with the trial that's happening and implicating John, there are so many unanswered questions that need to come into play. I'm very, very curious how this whole series is going to wrap up. And the final snippet of me recording things, I'm going to be going over all of the little pieces and just checking to see if any of them have not yet been addressed by the time this whole thing is over. Why was Cynthia so groggy the night of the incident? Why was Dr. Bauerstein covered in dried mud the afternoon of the incident? Who broke the round tabletop? What did Lawrence see behind on who stole the key to the document case? All sorts of stuff has not yet been even addressed, much less answered. So this whole trial and all the evidence that's being presented, I'm just pushing it aside. That's not anything that I think needs to be focused on at the moment. And for the both of our sakes, I'm eager to just get to the next chapter. You're probably eager to get to the next chapter. So let's just go ahead and do that. And let's take a look at chapter 12. Holy shit. So that happened. Wow. I imagine that there have been people watching this video, reading along, and have been screaming at me several times because I got one or two pieces of key information wrong. Absolutely wrong. And it took this chapter here to kind of highlight why that was. So let me get into that real quick here. Let me correct myself way, way, way too late. I don't think it really matters in the grand scheme of things. It wouldn't have led to any more new revelations, but it was some fine details. And this is nothing if it's not about the fine details. So, first of all, the entry point was not Cynthia Murdoch's room. I read that incorrectly. So let's get back to why I thought that. So let's get back to chapter 3, the night of the tragedy. And it says here, try going through Mr. Inglethorpe's room, cried Dorcas. Oh, the poor mistress. We went straight to the connecting door. That too was locked or bolted on the inside. What was to be done? Then they talk about going to Cynthia's room. And let's see. So they go to Cynthia's room. That's where they find Mary shaking the girl who must have been sleeping and try to wake her. In a moment or two, he was back. That's the portion that I kind of glossed over. Said, no good, that's bolted too. We must break in the door. So while he's saying this and they break down the door, he is back in Mr. Inglethorpe's room and not in Cynthia's room as I was mistaken. So let's correct that now. The entry point was here. The entry point was here, which means the green fiber was found in Cynthia's adjacent room, because that portion there, I did get right. It was a little confusing in the reading, but I was kind of curious as to how I got that portion wrong, and it turns out I didn't. He said, next, he examined the framework of the door we had broken in, assuring himself that the bolt had really been shot. Then he went to the door opposite, leading into Cynthia's room. I just read the door opposite. So, yeah, my mistake, and I cop to that. There's going to be some fine details here that I'm going to get wrong, and unfortunately, that could be in big ramifications down the road. I don't think this was a huge ramification. This was honestly just kind of a little bit of a fine detail point. Either way, they broke down the door and the green fiber was found in the door opposite. So it just so happened that the green fiber was found in the room where Mary was shaking Cynthia. That may have led to a little bit of a brain spark there, but honestly, I don't think so. My brain doesn't quite spark that much. But so much has been answered, and I did get a few things right. First of all, I did get the idea that the coffee, that the brown stain by the window was caused by coffee that had been placed on the table and knocked over in the same way that Poirot's case fell. Additionally, I also surmised that there were overlapping incidences of the murder and not necessarily the murder. Perhaps somebody looking for something, perhaps somebody coming in with the candle and leaving candle grease on the floor. And turns out I didn't attribute it to anybody because it honestly could have been anybody. And it turns out in this case, it was Mary, who wasn't necessarily she wasn't necessarily innocent. And that's the thing that is going to be kind of a theme throughout a lot of these books, I have a feeling, is determining who is guilty of the crime and who is guilty of something else that is causing them to hide evidence. And then with all the clues that are put into place, where do those wind up on either of those two paths? If somebody like Mary was up to her own shenanigans with the evidence that she thought that she wanted to snag, so she did her own thing and then hid the coffee cup in the brass vase, and this whole thing that she would not tell Poirot, and this happened, it's simultaneously parallel incidences with the murder, then it does become kind of a dividing line between what clue goes where, what is pertinent, what isn't, what is totally irrelevant between either of those incidences. What if there's a third incident? There's a lot to sift through, but I was right that there did seem to be two separate incidences in that room. Mary with her shenanigans, and then something else, which didn't necessarily actually have to happen in that room. It was something that was set up ahead of time. And that was honestly one of the biggest reveals here, is that on the grand timeline, as far as the discrepancy, that wasn't necessarily a discrepancy. I was kind of right about that. So looking at that, we have 4 o'clock, Dorcas overhears the argument. 4:15 to 4:30, the gardeners sign the witness to the will. And then 5 o'clock, Dorcas brings Mrs. Inglethorpe the tea. So it's honestly kind of exactly how I pictured it, that she sent the gardeners to fetch the will. Then the argument happened between her and John. I was right about that not being Mr. Inglethorpe. And then the gardeners come back. She signs the will and has them witness it. And then we have the thing at 5 o'clock where she seems to be despondent about the husband and wife scandal, but it turns out it's a totally different husband and wife scandal, totally different circumstances. The argument at 4 o'clock has no real bearing on her feelings when talking with Dorcas at 5 o'clock. A lot has changed in the course of an hour. And what has changed is that letter that Poirot found. And my God, what a letter. Dearest Evelyn. Oh my God, that tore my heart out. That was like the one person in all of this that I did not suspect in the slightest of anything was Evie Evelyn Howard. My God. I did not see that coming at all. But regardless, dearest Evelyn, you will be anxious at hearing nothing. It is all right, only it will be tonight instead of last night. You understand. There's a good time coming once the old woman is dead and out of the way. No one can possibly bring home the crime to me. That idea of yours about the bromides was a stroke of genius, but we must be very circumspect of one false step. So, quite clever. not only do we have the circumstances that allow for the strychnine to have had a delayed reaction with the sleeping powders in effect delivered by Mary, we also have a methodology for the strychnine to be introduced in a way that would not have any kind of attention drawn to it, and would almost be like just like this long fuse that was lit that eventually would yield the results. All they had to do was add a little bit of bromide to the tonic so it wouldn't really raise any eyebrows. Pretty clever. That's darn clever stuff. I would never have thought of that in terms of making any kind of assumptions for the killer or the methodology for the weapon of poison to be delivered. That just never, ever, ever would have entered into anything I had. So at this point, let's take a look real quick before we get to the last chapter here and just take a quick look at the bits and questions and see what's been already kind of addressed now, because a lot has happened right here in chapter 12. So someone bought strychnine to frame Alfred. That's an interesting one. Like, we do have the situation with framing Alfred, and I think we're probably going to get to that. Maybe Alfred was trying to frame himself in a way that was very, like, too obvious so that he could be cleared when he was able to prove that he had an alibi. The fact that it was a warm, sunny day, that finally came home, not with the window being open, as I suspected, but with the discrepancy with the fireplace being lit. So that was kind of a cool thing there. Dr. Bauerstein covered in mud. Still haven't really addressed that. Access to poison cabinet at Cynthia's workplace. That may simply just have been a red herring. That could be that Lawrence fiddled with the bottle and that's all it was. That seems a little unlikely, but that very well could be. He could have just been taking him at his word and there's nothing left other than that. Mary did not go on the planned walk with Dr. Bauerstein and seemed upset. So that could have been... Dr. Bauerstein still is a bit of a card with all this, an unknown. The fact that he was covered in mud, the fact that he didn't go on the walk. It could be that Mary was upset. Let me take a look at I just actually thought of something here. Let me take a look at the quick timeline here. So back at the house, Mary didn't walk with Dr. Bauerstein. Mrs. Inglethorpe upset about something. Okay, so Mary being upset when Hastings came back to the house after the luncheon might not have been, in all likelihood, you know what, was not related to missing her walk with Dr. Bauerstein. It was simply the argument that she overheard and the incidences that have happened, and then her argument with Mrs. Inglethorpe at that. So yeah, that explains that perfectly well. So that bit is done. The questions here. Who killed Mrs. Inglethorpe? Well, we kind of got that. We still don't know a little bit of the pieces that need to fit together of that. We know the cause of death now. We know that it was the tonic that contained strychnine that had the bromine added. Who stole the key to the document case? Well, we know that now. Why did Lawrence follow Alfred in delivering the coffee? Still not sure on that one. That could be that I was just reading way, way, way more into that one line than was actually necessary. That's entirely possible. I thought for sure I had a gotcha. We have one more chapter to find out. But yeah, that may have just been, he followed him. Okay. Who broke the round tabletop, spilling coffee and when? Well, we know that was Mrs. Inglethorpe now. What was in the paper that Mrs. Inglethorpe was talking, shooketh about? Oh my goodness. What indeed? That was a revelation. Who was Mrs. Inglethorpe arguing with that Dorcas overheard? Yep, we got that. Why was Cynthia found so groggy the night of the murder? Yep, we got that. And where was Mrs. Inglethorpe? Where was Mr. Inglethorpe at the time of the murder in actuality? I have a feeling that is going to definitely be answered in this last chapter. So without further ado, I know I'm going to do like a big wrap up thing here and we'll take a look at all of it. I'm very eager to see how this all shakes out. So let's get to reading the last chapter, chapter 13, as we finish off the mysterious affair at Styles. Well then, thank you so much for joining me on this video journey as we read together The Mysterious Affair at Styles. A whole lot of revelations, a whole lot of loose threads finely tuned and connected and tied up in a nice, neat little bow. So let's take a look at some of the evidence that we found here. So we had the saucepan of cocoa, which was tested for strychnine, but only later under Poirot's direction tested for the bromine. We have the something that scared Lawrence. And in this, I was taking that to be on the fireplace because of the line here where Lawrence was white as chalk. I could see nothing unusual. The still feebly flickering ashes in the grate and the row of prim ornaments on the mantelpiece were surely harmless enough. However, if we take into account that they are both coming in through door B here and over by the bed watching Mrs. Inglethorpe convulse, we are generally looking at going this direction. So what could easily have been pointing at the fireplace was instead shock at what he saw in this door, which was that the bolt was undone. And loving Cynthia as he does, Lawrence becomes involved in dismantling a bunch of evidence that would have helped the case along a little bit more, except that he was trying to protect Cynthia, whom he loved. We have the stain on the floor, smells of coffee. We've already addressed that. Same with the green fabric, same with the candle grease stain. Same with the purple dispatch case with the key in the lock, although now we know why it was broken into forcefully later on when Poirot was in the house. Alfred's doing in trying to retrieve the incriminating letter. Debris, mostly the broken coffee cup, smashed to powder. Now we know that it was Lawrence, and the empty sleeping powders box with no chemist's name. So that's all well and tidied up. We do have the letter that was written to Evelyn by Mrs. Inglethorpe that we now know, based on the spacing of the words, that doesn't match with July 17th, and the one was written in by Evelyn later to throw suspicion off from the actual letter that was written on July 17th. Now, cast of characters, and I gotta say, out of all my suspicions, let's go back to the persons of interest. It was none of them. Not a one. Nobody. I was totally wrong. I am proud of a lot of the progress that I made in this, and I'm pretty happy with, I would say, on estimation of all the stuff that I threw against the wall and wild theories, I probably got, I would say, between 15 to 20% of them correct. And I'm pretty happy with that number. There was a lot of stuff going on in this, and just a massive amount of hidden things, stuff happening under the surface, and the fact that I got clued in on several points of that, I'm still proud of. Yeah, I got 80% of it wrong, including the actual murders. But that's neither here nor there. I'm kind of curious how you did. I'm curious what your theories were. I'm curious if you enjoyed this book. I'm curious if you enjoyed this video. I am going to continue on with all of the rest of Agatha Christie's novels and doing something similar to this. I can't promise it's going to be exactly the same, just because as I continue doing these, I'm going to learn more about the board and how to lay it out and how to, read the books and get the fine details right, hopefully, and go from there. But structurally, I think this is going to be very much the same. I'm very much looking forward to doing all of Agatha Christie's novels in this vein of a read along with me that covers it chapter by chapter, analyzing the evidence, coming up with theories, and getting 80% of them wrong, most likely. So I hope you could join me as we continue on this journey. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe. And again, I'm very curious what your thoughts were on any portion of this, on the video, on the book, on the theories, on any of this. Please leave comments below. I would love to read anything that you would love to write to me about the mysterious affair at Styles. So thank you again for joining, and I'll talk to you on my next video. Take care.